I want to thank everyone for attending the 73rd Commission annual meeting, and welcome to the great state of Texas. Over the past several years, the Commission has had a variety of general sessions during the TCC, and we've talked about a whole slew of issues, including economics, mercury, oysters, harmful algal blooms, recreational fishing, invasive species, and a variety of other things. This session will be examining how advanced technologies is being used to improve our understanding of marine fisheries and collect important data to help guide management. So I will turn it back to Chairman Topping to get the session going. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, we have our first presentation here by Matt Womble. We were fortunate last year in the last meeting, the CMAP committee, to hear some of this information, and it was fairly interesting. And so we brought him into the TCC for this technologies general session. And it's going to be an online. He's going to do this remotely, so hopefully that works out for this morning. But we have it queued up, and you go ahead, Matt, if you're ready.
Yeah. Good morning. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And just to confirm, how much time do I have? I want to make sure I'm respectful of your time, knowing y'all have a tight agenda. I don't want to encroach on your breaks.
I believe with questions, each person has about 30 minutes. Okay,
perfect. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with y'all today. Enjoyed being with y'all in person a few months ago, and thankful I can try to do this remotely. And looking forward to telling everybody a little bit about Saildrone and some of the work that we're doing specifically within marine fisheries, and then share some other vignettes regarding ocean mapping and some of the meta-ocean data collection that we're doing with our platforms. So I'll just start with a primer about Saildrone. Y'all can see the screen here, and you can see the vehicles that we manufacture and own and operate. So the thing to know about Saildrone is we are the manufacturer, owner, operator of uncrewed surface vehicles, similar to what you see here on the screen. The thing that makes these vehicles unique is that they are largely completely renewable powered. So we use wind for propulsion, and we harness the sun's energy for power of all of our onboard sensors. The vehicles are equipped and integrated with a suite of about 20 both atmospheric and oceanographic sensors that are configurable for different mission suites across different domains of ocean science. Let's see, I'm gonna try to see if I can control. Let's see. Charlie, I am unable to get the slides to advance. I may need. There we go. Okay. So a little bit about Saildrone from a history perspective. The platform that I just showed you on the screen, it's recognized both from a government perspective with our government customers, primarily NOAA and NASA, but other customers we use as a TRL-9 system. It's been tested and put out to sea for nearly 10 years now. It's sailed in excess of 800,000 nautical miles in every ocean basin that you can imagine. If there is a first for an uncrewed surface vehicle, we have done it. We have sailed, like I said, in excess of 800,000 nautical miles. We spent over 15,000 days at sea, and a vast majority of that 15,000 days at sea has been under contract with the U.S. government. And a lot of those days under contract with the U.S. government have been with our fisheries partners, fisheries customers, whether that's in Europe, but also primarily on the west coast of the United States with Southwest Fisheries Science Center, Northwest Fisheries Science Center, and Alaska Fisheries Science Center doing acoustic fisheries work, which I'll talk in more detail about. Next slide. It's important to know kind of the niche that Saildrone itself was trying to solve when the founders of the company came up with this idea about 10 years ago and put it into practice. What they saw was a gap in how the oceans were observed and how ocean science was being conducted. Ships have been the stalwart of ocean science for many, many years. And while ships are incredibly capable, they do have their limitations. They can be expensive to operate. And for most part, they provide low time series because they have consumables on board and people on board, and those things have to come back. So ships enable, in the graph on the left, you see low time series, but really high spatial coverage. So it's a very valuable tool in the quiver to have for ocean science. Similar to that, in the bottom right-hand corner, other in situ, uncrewed, unmanned observing systems like buoys provide you long time series but low spatial coverage, right? So these assets are moored to the bottom, they're not moving around. They can stay out there for a long period of time, but you're not getting the large spatial. So they require a large amount of them to give you spatial coverage. Saildrone was envisioned as a tool that could fit in the middle of these two sort of stalwarts of ocean observing, by providing long time series observations across large spatial areas. And I put the map on the right here of this slide to sort of demonstrate this with one of our most recently completed missions, which was a 370-day mission that involved two transatlantic crossings, and like I said, 370 days of continuous ocean observing down to the equator in the equatorial Atlantic. So next slide. Saildrone has developed its platforms to be able to fit into three verticals, three sort of niches within the ocean space. The first being ocean data, which you see on the right-hand side. That's essential ocean and climate variables. It's work like Fisheries work I'll talk more about in a little bit. Meta-ocean data collection, ecosystem monitoring, etc. We also have capabilities in two other verticals: ocean mapping. So this is single beam and multi-beam bathymetry data, also sub-bottom profiling capabilities, and then maritime domain awareness, which is eyes and ears on the water, and then using artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies that are on board the vehicles to analyze that information in real time, provide folks sitting on shore with a real-time picture of what's happening on the ocean. That's mostly work that we do for the Department of Defense and Homeland Security. Next slide. We have multiple vehicle classes, and these different vehicle classes are all purpose-built for a different function. Primarily for our meteorological and oceanographic and fisheries related work, we use our Explorer platform, which is what you saw on the first slide, and you see here pictured on the left-hand side of the screen. It's a 23-foot long vehicle, again, completely renewable powered, wind and solar, and is purpose-built really for that MEDOC fisheries vertical of work. Our other two vehicle platforms, which you see here, Voyager in the middle. This is sort of the Goldilocks drone, as we refer to it, the do everything. It is really purpose-built to try to do both maritime domain awareness, but also shallow water multi-beam work. And then Surveyor, which is the largest of the three classes, 72 feet, and is purpose-built for deep water multi-beam and maritime domain awareness work. The one differentiating thing I'll say about Voyager and Surveyor is these vehicle classes are not completely renewable powered. They both have onboard engines, and that with auxiliary propulsion capabilities that allow it to be able to continue to sample and do work in the absence of wind, right? So if you're a wind powered vehicle, when we lose wind with our Explorer class vehicles, we are no longer doing work. We have to have wind to be able to move around. Voyager and Surveyor, like I said, have that auxiliary propulsion capabilities to be able to overcome that limitation. The other differentiating thing here that I know is important for the fisheries community is CTDs and water column monitoring. So Voyager is equipped with a CTD that can go down to 150 meters, and Surveyor is equipped with a CTD that can go down to 500 meters. And both those systems have been tested and worked resoundingly well, and I'll show an example of that with one of our more recent Surveyor missions. Next slide. The business model of Saildrone is important to know. We don't sell our platforms, so while we're a boat builder, we don't sell our boats. Our commodity is data. So we offer our vehicles on a per day operational basis, where we have pilots that pilot the vehicles, operate them in conjunction with customers, and what the customer gets in return is a mission that's executed per their requests and data, and then the data in return that they are seeking. So it's a lot of advantages of that business model for customers. It doesn't require any acquisition dollars, doesn't require any maintenance dollars, doesn't really require any operations dollars. What you get from us is data that you really want, and you have all of the headaches of operating systems on the ocean are no longer your problem. If a Saildrone vehicle breaks while on mission, that's our problem, and it's our responsibility to furnish another vehicle to complete the mission. So a lot of the hassles of operating things on the ocean are mitigated via our model. The important thing about that model is that data is the crux of everything for us, and if we don't have good data quality, then it doesn't matter. I always tell people internally at Saildrone, we can have this cute enamoring orange vehicle, but if the data sucks, nobody's going to buy it. So we take data quality really, really seriously, and what we have done been doing for the past 8 years is running our platform side by side with other validated and sort of state-of-the-art in situ observation, ocean in situ observing systems. You can see here us doing a mission side by side with the Reuben Lasker. We've done this with a number of NOAA ships. We've done it with another number of other oceanographic ships. We've done it with a number of other in situ ocean platforms to validate the sensor suite that we have integrated is providing accurate measurements. And we do this pre-mission, post-mission for all of our work. So, and every sensor that we have integrated in the system, there is a peer-reviewed paper from either a NOAA scientist or an academic validating the quality of the observations that we're collecting from the Saildrone platform. Next slide. And if data is your commodity, you have to have a way to serve data to people. What you see here is our web-based mission portal. So this is where we serve data to customers in real time while on mission. There's two types of data that's collected. There's near real-time data, which is what you see here on the right-hand side of the computer screen embedded within the slide. This is a live feed of data coming off of the vessel in real time. You can see the downsampled echogram there. We provide that near real-time data, and a lot of that data is downsampled, so it's not high-resolution data. It is low-resolution data, but it still gives you a picture of what's happening. For a lot of the metocean variables, it's 1 minute resolution, and you can sort of see there the resolution of the echogram that you see in real time. We also store all the high-resolution data on the vehicle, and once the vehicles are returned to base or are brought back to shore, we're able to take the baseboards off the vehicles, quickly download that high-resolution data, and make that data available to customers. So two types of data. In addition to data from the mission portal, you can also see that you get to visualize where the vehicles are in real time, provide instructions via the mission portal to our pilots to operate the vehicles and communicate with them as well. So next slide. I think you can advance to. So I'm just going to start by talking about our fisheries work, which I think would be most important for you all. This is elementary for many of you all, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about this other than want folks to know, and the message we always tell people, we are looking to be an augmenter to the traditional observing systems that are used for fisheries management. We never envisioned that we're going to be pulling nets or trawling off the back of our uncrewed systems. That's not realistic. What we want to do is do the things that are really boring to do on ships with robots. So for any of you that have been out doing acoustic work on ships, you know it's can sometimes make you feel like a robot, and robots can do that work very effectively with our Saildrones and enable the ships, which are very capable at doing other things, potentially trawling, primarily trawling, to be able to do more of that work. So again, we are not looking to replace ships. We're not looking to get in the way of that work. What we want to do is use robots to try to augment the existing ocean observing platforms that are out there. And particularly within fisheries world, that's trying to do a lot of the acoustics work. The next slide. So I'm just going to talk about the sort of life cycle of Saildrone proving out its acoustics capabilities within fisheries and sort of the 3 steps that we had to go through to really get to the final point. And that final point being our data actually being used for regulatory management by NOAA beginning in 2020. So first was precision. As you can imagine, there was a lot of folks that were dubious about the capabilities of Saildrone to actually go out and replace and sail the transects traditionally sailed by ships, beginning in 2015, but really coming into earnest in 2019. We started doing a lot of acoustic surveys on the West Coast. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen here, those transects, that's 60 to 40 mile long transects from Port Flattery, Washington, all the way to the US-Mexico border. We've done this survey now for 4 consecutive years, or actually 5 consecutive years, with both Southwest Fisheries Science Center and Northwest Fisheries Science Centers sailing those transects. We use 2 vehicles that work simultaneously side by side to do that work. And have been able to demonstrate an ability to really sail those transects. You can see in the top middle picture, 2 vehicles there sailing along that green transect line and for collecting data. So first box we had to check with NOAA was precision, and we've proven that out over the course of many years of doing this work. Next slide. The second was to demonstrate that our vehicles were collecting data that was comparable, and if not better, than what you collected from traditional assets, in this case being ships. The real hallmark work of this was work we did with the Alaska Fisheries Science Center doing pollock acoustic work. And that work began in earnest again in 2015, and is something that we've done all the way up until 2020 with them. The exciting part about this work is that we at least found for some of the shallow water pollock in Alaska that Saildrones, when sailed side by side with NOAA vessels, were actually detecting larger, more abundant. They were detecting more pollock than what the ships were. Some hypotheses that that's due to the fact that the ship noise is distributing the pollock in a different way than what the completely silent Saildrone platform itself is. So there's some sort of reaction to ship noise. But in the end, it was determined that the data being collected from Saildrone was as accurate, if not more accurate, than what we were getting from ships. So that calibration and validation of the vehicles side by side with was checked as well. And then the next slide was our ability to do the surveys independently of ships, and that data be used and accepted by a council and used for regulatory purposes. So COVID probably fast forwarded this process for us. I'm not sure if we would have done it in 2020, but COVID gave us the opportunity to. So what you see on the left is a map of the transit that we had to do with our vehicles from San Francisco, California, all the way up to the Bering Sea to do the acoustic pollock survey in 2020. There's 2,700 miles one way. This was, again, when all the NOAA ships were stuck in port because of COVID. They had to get their acoustic pollock survey done, one of the more valuable fisheries in the United States. We sent 3 vessels up. We did a survey in 3 months that you can see depicted on the middle left or middle top screen, the green, pink, and blue lines. We then sailed the vehicles home, offloaded the data, sent that data to the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. 6 months later, that data was used by the council to set a catch quota for the upcoming pollock season. That was $100 million more than it would have been in absence of that data. And so check the box of our data being able to be used and approved by both NOAA and the council for regulatory purposes. Next slide. And then a non-acoustic, or at least direct fisheries acoustic method or activity that we've done that I wanted to highlight, as I know is important for a lot of folks in the Gulf, is using acoustics to track movements. So in 2019, we used our vehicles to do an acoustic survey of movement of Alaska red king crabs. So you can see in the bottom left-hand picture here, the Alaska red king crabs tagged with acoustic receivers or with acoustic tags. We had our vehicles equipped with Venco acoustic receivers. And we sailed transects all throughout Bristol Bay looking for those crabs. Remarkably, the vehicles found about 34% of the Alaska red king crabs that were tagged. For those of you that familiar with this work, you know that 34% in a tagging survey is pretty large and shows the utility of using these vehicles to sail to find transects to looking for tagged animals to try to discern movements. So another potential use case in the fisheries realm. Next slide. And then I just want to spend the next couple minutes just talking about ocean mapping and exploration and some of the capabilities that we have there. We're all familiar with the need for ocean mapping and exploration. See on the left, 52% of U.S. coastal ocean and Great Lakes waters are unmapped. A lot of that in the Gulf of Mexico is near shore coastal environments that are unmapped. Those are obviously important fishing areas for both recreational and commercial. Saildrone is building out an uncrewed mapping capability that can help try to solve this problem. We don't need to get into the comparisons between ships and uncrewed systems. Again, both have a niche to be able to solve here, but those long duration mapping missions is something that an uncrewed system can do really, really well. Next slide. This is an example, one such example of that. This is the Aleutian Island mapping campaign that we just wrapped up. This is the first time that we have really put our surveyor vessel out on an operational mission. Some of the stats here, which I think are really compelling. We use less than 1 gallon per hour when we were actively surveying. That is a huge difference than what a survey ship requires. And we mapped 130 kilometers per day, or 80 miles of ground per day. You can see all the transects that we mapped here, and you can see this is the data that is actually returned in real time to customers. So 42 days on survey, 5,460 kilometers mapped, and again, less than 1 gallon per hour used per day. And then just a Gulf of Mexico, the next slide, one Gulf of Mexico vignette. We have put our capabilities out to work in the Gulf of Mexico. 2019, we partnered with USM University of Mississippi, and NOAA to complete a shallow water multi-beam bathymetry mission in the Gulf of Mexico. Spent 10 days out south of the Mississippi Barrier Islands and east of Chandelier, looking at what we thought we were just going to be looking at to find wrecks. We actually, and you can see one of those on the right-hand side, a down view of a NOAA shipwreck in the Gulf of Mexico. But in addition to that, while sailing out there, we also found and collected sonar data of an uncharted shipwreck in the Gulf of Mexico. So mapping technology has also been tested and proven in the Gulf of Mexico. And this is particularly important knowing that each region is different, and the Gulf of Mexico has a lot of obstructions with oil platforms and other assets. So I think I'll pause there in the sense of time, leave time for questions, and again, appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak with y'all today.
Thanks, Matt. So do you have more to present, or you said you're done?
I have a few more. I just want to make sure I'm conscious of your time. I'm happy to. I was going to show the hurricane work if that's of interest, but we can.
I think we have time.
Okay. All right. You got to just advance 2 slides real quick. And this is just other Gulf of Mexico missions, so things to show and demonstrate. This one I think is important from a platform reliability standpoint. So for the past 2 years, we've been putting our vehicles out with NOAA with the intention of putting them in Hurricane Alley in the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, with the intention of trying to stick them in the middle of a hurricane. Nobody before has really intentionally tried to stick an ocean asset in the middle of a hurricane, but it's what we are trying to do. You can see here where our vehicles were in 2021, primarily just in the Atlantic, but then 2022, we have 2 vehicles that have been in the Gulf of Mexico, plus the Atlantic. We have been able to intercept 2 Category 4 hurricane storms. If you advance to the next slide, you'll get to see an image of what it looks like from within the eye of Hurricane Fiona. This was during 135 mile an hour winds and 50 plus foot seas. To give you just the sort of scope of what happens to a vehicle within this, our vehicles typically sail around 2 knots. We had speeds up to 30 knots when we were going down the backside of some of these 50-foot waves with the vehicles. So just incredible ocean conditions, incredibly tumultuous ocean conditions. Our vehicles, each time we've put them into the Category 4 storms, have survived, and we've been able to recover those vehicles and sail those vehicles back to a port to collect the data, and in real time, obviously, transmit and collect these sorts of images from within the storm. And more importantly, collecting meteorological data from within these that allows forecasters to better predict hurricanes. And then one more slide. The other mission I wanted to share with you is another Gulf of Mexico mission we're doing right now. I think as most people here know, oceans are critically important for global weather, but the density of weather stations on the ocean, which you can see on the left-hand side here, is completely lacking. There are none, especially as you compare them to the density of meteorological stations on land. And on the right-hand slide, this is the National Data Buoy Center network. You can obviously see from all the red dots, it's expensive and it's hard to maintain an ocean network. Next slide. We are currently out at sea with the National Data Buoy Center doing meteorological and oceanographic data collection with our platforms. This is a completely different mission for us. We're not sailing those large spatial areas like I talked about in the beginning. We're actually trying to keep the vehicles and hold the vehicles in very tight circles around where the traditional buoys would be. So you can see that here, 10-mile radius station keeping around the buoy in the Gulf of Mexico. All of you are familiar with the Gulf of Mexico, and you know that these 2 locations here are slap dab in the middle of the loop current, which is probably the toughest place for us to try to send a wind-powered vehicle into a 4-kilometer current and try to hold them there. But we've been successful in doing it, and you can actually access and see the data coming off the Saildrones in real time via the National Data Buoy Center website. So another application here that while doing fisheries work and other types of work, we are also transmitting back and sending back oceanographic and meteorological data from the ocean that can be used for managers. And that is everything I have. I look forward to your questions, and again, appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all this morning.
All right, thanks, Matt. Thanks for the extra slides. Those are pretty interesting. It's inside of a hurricane.
Yeah.
That's not easy to do with anything else. So, are there any questions? Committee or
I have a question. You showed us a little bit of information about the fuel savings between what your drones were using on an hourly basis. Do you have any information on just like a percentage cost savings in terms of what it costs to run these vehicles versus a typical survey ship?
Yeah, it's hard to know because a lot of the survey ships don't necessarily broadcast pricing. I'm happy to tell you what the costs are for our vehicles. So for the Explorer class vehicle, which was the smallest of the vehicles, that vehicle is about $2,800 per day. Our Voyager class, which is our middle class vehicle, is about $5,000 per day. And remember that vehicle is really a shallow water multi-beam platform. And then the Surveyor, which is our deep water multi-beam platform, is about $25,000 per day.
Thank you.
We have another question from the crowd. You need to come up to this mic. Yeah. Forget his name. So Trevor has a question.
Good. So kind of playing off that last question, would you theorize that with increases in efficiency and technology and kind of getting this platform online over the last 6 years and the next coming decade that those prices would become a little bit more would those prices get to a point where it'd be a little bit more accessible to states? Right? Oftentimes we're not operating on $1 million budgets. It's, a limited amount. So would you see any, gains in efficiency and drops in prices?
Yeah, I think it's hard to necessarily predict where prices will go. I think there certainly is I think from a competition landscape, that's what really drives pricing. There certainly is getting to be more competition in this space. I'll say for the vast majority of our meteorological, oceanographic, and fisheries missions, we're not working on $1 million contracts either. Most of those vehicles are structured from a cost perspective in recognition that budgets for that sort of work are not where budgets are for other applications. So encourage you to reach out. We're going to have a conversation about it, but certainly, yes, I think that over time you'll see competition continue to drive prices down in some of this area.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, Matt, to echo Trevor's comment, I mean, that's basically the bottom line is we see the potential for all the potential that these would provide for our surveys and just, you could open up a whole nother world of options, but it's the price, honestly, for most people here, I'm sure.
The other thing I would encourage is we do, a lot of ways that we try to get creative with that is multi-mission capabilities. So the vehicles don't have to be viewed in a singular lens in terms of just one mission, because they can be integrated with up to really about 20 instruments at one time. There's opportunities to do multi-mission opportunities. There's opportunities to do kind of daisy-chained missions in a lot of instances, which can save on things. So, but completely understand there can be some sticker shock.
I have another couple questions. Tony?
This is Tony Reisinger with Sea Grant. Do you have the capability of monitoring harmful algal blooms, like putting cytobots on those drones?
So we have looked at it in the past. We don't currently have the capability, mostly because from an imaging flow cytobot standpoint, we have limited space, and most of the systems to some degree are large right now, but also require a large amount of bandwidth to be able to send some of that data back in real time. And so if we're not near shore with a connection to be able to do it, it wraps up a lot of our communication bandwidth. So short answer is no, we don't have a flow cytobot integrated on the system, but as that technology continues to improve and we look at onboard processing of images on some of the systems, I think that that's a system we will look to integrate in future years.
Glad to hear it's promising. Thank you.
We have another question. You state your name.
From Wausau, Louisiana, Sea Grant. How shallow can these drones go? Could they be accurately applied to an estuarine type situation, a delta estuary like in Louisiana?
Yeah, so it depends on the vehicles itself have a 3-meter keel, so they look identical to a sailboat, and you see them out of the water. Because of the fact we're operating them remotely, we try to avoid getting in anything shallower than about 6 to 7 meters. It gives us 50% essentially depth underneath the keel. So it just really depends on the environment. But for the most part, we do not operate we try to operate further offshore in deeper waters.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else, Matt? All right. Thanks, Matt. I don't see any more questions.
Great. Thank you all.
Appreciate it. All right. Next, we have another virtual talk. We're going to have Meg Lamonte present as well on the advances in marine and animal telemetry sensors and analyses.
Thank you. Hopefully you can all hear me okay.
Yeah, we hear you.
Great, thanks. I want to start again by thanking you all for the invitation to talk today. My name is Meg Lamonte. I'm a research biologist at the Wetland and Aquatic Research Center in Gainesville, Florida. I oversee a research program that focuses on the ecology of coastal and marine vertebrate species. Many of the issues that we address in our research program requires the collection and analysis of movement data. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. We were originally going to focus this talk solely on our Gulf sturgeon work, but we expanded the scope to include other large marine vertebrate species, so we can include technologies that are being used with those other species but aren't being used heavily with fish yet. With me are 2 of my team members who are actually going to be the ones giving most of the presentation. Mike Randall is a biologist who has worked with multiple marine species and habitats. Most recently, he's been overseeing the field activities for the Gulf Sturgeon program. He has extensive experience working in the Gulf and a wealth of knowledge about the various habitats in the region. Melissa Price is a biologist who has strong quantitative skills, particularly with an emphasis on movement data. She spent much of her career also working with Gulf sturgeon, but has recently expanded to include most of the large marine vertebrates that we study. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Good morning, and it was good to hear Glenn Constant out there. So, because we work with mostly the federal listed species, this is going to be heavy on the sturgeon and sea turtles, but it's also a little more going forward into other species and future casting of where sensors and telemetry I expect it to be going. So, Joe, can we advance the slide? I don't see. If you're going to be doing animal monitoring in the marine environment, you have a couple of different options, a handful of tools. If you just need to know presence or absence, you can use, and you have a soniferous kind of animal, you can use passive acoustic monitoring. You can use eDNA and you can use sonar. If you actually want to know where locations, if you've got an animal that is always in the water, say a fish, you're used to acoustic tags or some versions of archival tags, pop-off sat tags, or regular archivals. If you've got a critter that breaches the surface, like the sea turtles or manatees, sharks, you can use satellite, or if you've got one that sticks close to the surface now, you can use some cellular telemetry, basically varieties of radio telemetry. Next. Most of y'all have probably done this in the past, but telemetry used to be a very simple single point process, manual telemetry. You went out there, you ran around with a radio antenna, you stuck a hydrophone in the water, You celebrated when you triangulated a point. Resulted in limited data collection. It was labor intensive, expensive, daytime, fair weather, and you had some big data gaps. 24 hours later, you're trying to find a critter that you found, yesterday, don't know where it went to between there. Nowadays, the Saildrone people mentioned robots. That's where we're headed. A lot of automation. The idea is basically to get down to 24/7, 365 detections, reduced effort from the data collection. It's a lot more effort in terms of installing the receivers. High data intensity, lower data gaps, and the basic trend is and continues to be smaller, cheaper, and faster. The cheaper is kind of at least in terms of data points, not necessarily the amount of money you're spending. Next slide, please. So acoustic telemetry is where I've mostly been working. In the last several years, since about 2007, there was the Canadians invested in one company, Vemco, that has become the de facto standard. Basically, they built a better mousetrap and everybody has flocked to it. And because it's become a standard now, my tags can be picked up by other people's receivers. And so what you have are these arrays that have grown into basin scale arrays. And even in some cases like Australia, continental scale arrays. The receiver just sits there, does one thing, does it very well, just listens. When a fish with an active tag swims past, somewhere between 600 to 200 meters, depending on background noise, it picks it up, it logs it, and it just stores that data. And you have to go out and upload them. There are several ways of uploading them, and the methodologies for doing that are getting more and more into the automation side of things. So, the standard right now is manual. You go out, you retrieve your receiver, download it, put it back. But you're getting into acoustic modem uploads. So for deep water materials, you just leave the receiver down there and sail a ship or increasingly a drone over top of it and upload. Or you get a wired receiver and you upload it via a satellite or cellular connection. The tag sizes have been decreasing over time, which means that the animals taggable have been increasing over time. As your tag size goes down, the smaller critter you can put it on, increases the number of species you can reach. The trade-offs for all of that are basically if the tag is broadcasting and there's no receiver there to listen to it, it doesn't do you any good. So it's spatially restricted. Because you're just broadcasting a single, if all you know is it's somewhere in the detection radius of that receiver. You can get into higher scale resolutions, but you have to increase the number of receivers, which drives your cost factors up. Over time, the battery density, energy density has been increasing, and so the battery life has expanded as well. One of these, in terms of talking about our critters, your critter going into somebody else's array, this one down here on the bottom right is one of our sturgeon that went into a sawfish array in Charlotte Harbor, swam around, and so we got the data from that through a cooperation. Next slide. The satellite telemetry has more or less supplemented or supplanted radio telemetry entirely in the marine. So the size of the PTTs, the platform terminals, has decreased over time, and the complexity of them has increased. Meg uses these a lot on turtles. We obviously don't use them on fish, but you can start to get a lot more information off of them. The change from Argos down to Iridium satellites has allowed a bunch of additional sensors on the tag, has allowed a bunch of, so you can get GPS fixes between satellite passes. You can do temp, depth, light. Trade-off requires the surfacing of an animal. You only get those fixes in between. And the location quality, depending on whether you're using Argos or Iridium, GPS tags or not, can sometimes be iffy. And the battery life on a sat tag, most of the time you get 6 months. If you get a year, you're lucky. So next slide. Logging tags is a whole category, basically the archival tags, plus a bunch of specialized tags. These almost always require recovery of the tag, which you can either use, so like the pop-off sat tags, PSATs, and a few of the other ones. This is a accelerometer tag with a timer and a line cutter on it that we used on sturgeon. Gulf sturgeon are famous for jumping. That triptych down at the bottom right, that's a fish in the middle of a jump and accelerating upwards, flipping over in the center, crashing back down into the water. We put this ADL on and happened to catch a couple of jumps. So the top right is a longer time span showing that jump. The bottom right is that jump condensed down into a few seconds, where you can see the fish, the tail beat of the fish accelerate, tail of the fish rises to the surface, jumps, rolls a little bit as it turns, dives down. The problem with these is that the data intensity, because of the sampling rate, is very high, and so the storage capacity, even though they're increasing over time, these tags are very short duration, 24 hours, 48 hours. The amount of sensors that are out there is increasing, and so you can start to get some really interesting things with magnetic heading, rolls, tilt, but again, you have to recover these off of the fish. So pop-off sat tags in sturgeon don't work very well because the fish stay shallow and they become rapidly overgrown, and they don't have a clear transmit plane when they get to the surface. If they even arrive to the surface, we've recovered a couple, but it's pretty low odds. With blue water fish like turtle or like tuna, it works better. The tags don't get as encrusted and give more data. There's a couple other styles of tags out there. Vemco has a VMT, the chat tag, that detects other acoustic tags nearby. So next slide. Cameras are basically another version of a logging tag. It's, you have either two types. You have location cameras or you have critter cams. This is a critter cam on a turtle, basically showing that it's, moving around, associating with other turtles, associates with an old crab trap in a second. This is very narrow field of view, very specific to short durations and locations, but it gives you a level of detail that you would never get off of anything else. With a course that has drawbacks, it's basically daytime, shallow water, good light situations, clean water. The amount of information and sensors that are being built into these as well is increasing. You can now get these with ADL, with accelerometers, data loggers as well. But again, it has to be recovered, and battery life, although the Leonardos are starting to go with rechargeables, some of the other ones are less functional. But it's mostly getting it on and off the turtle or the critter that matters. So next slide. Sonar, we don't use sonar that much or as much as fisheries, other fisheries do. For instance, the Saildrone people just talked about their sonar surveys of pollock. Gulf states, we might do a little bit, but not much. Mostly in the sturgeon world, we're using side scan. It's changed the way we fish for sturgeon, in that you can run a side scan survey, see an individual animal or a bunch of animals, be able to tell where they are. And so instead of doing blind nets, we're now doing targeted. We're switching from prosumer grade up to low-end professional grade. So we're acquiring one of these edge tech systems that's in the top right at our lab. coming in, I think, next month. And the bottom, that's Flowers and Hightower. And you can see from using an edge tech, you can see the shadow cast showing a sturgeon with that particular caudal tail. But basically, this is a standoff method. It allows a larger swept area than the videos do. Works in, dirtier water than a video. You can use various styles that get tighter, like the acoustic cameras, the Aris and the Didson. The field of view on those mostly used for salmon rather than sturgeon. We haven't really used these things for turtles much. Turtles tend to hang on the bottom and they're very difficult to differentiate, whereas sturgeon hang off the bottom and they're better at being able to see them. So next slide. Drones and floats. This is you just saw the Saildrone. There's a typical picture of the Saildrone. There's a couple of different kinds of those surface ones. There's wave glider. There's a small spotter, is a interesting company that's been putting out some unique product recently. That's just right now purely a meteorological, but it's a smaller, cheaper, faster version where they're coming down to the point where you throw them out of a helicopter or out of a boat and let it float away, and then recover it when it comes ashore somewhere. Submerged, obviously, there's the Argo float system, sloping gliders. There's numerous AUVs out there, and as the Saildrone people mentioned, you can rig these with acoustic receivers, or act as downloaders. The Canadian Post lines are using a wave glider to download their VR4s, and basically replaced, going out in a 100-foot vessel that was required because of the distance they were going out, with sending out a single glider that sits over top of a VR4, downloads the data, moves to the next one. We don't use these yet. There's one research group in the Gulf of Mexico using some sort of a surface float to track sturgeon. I don't know exactly which one. But I anticipate seeing more of these in use in the future. Next slide. The increase in data intensity has led us basically to start grabbing techniques from big data. Basically, all of the consumer data from cell phones and vehicle tracking has led to changes in the way big data, I guess, is the overall term, but has led to changes in the analysis techniques that are available. And in biology, we're basically sitting there thinking we have big data with 1 or 2 million points, which big data thinks that we're just still piddling, but we've gone basically from a few thousand points in a telemetry array or a telemetry program to 1 million or several million points, and grown outside of the Excel capabilities. But R, Python, JAGs have now allowed us to handle what we consider massive data sets, and the new kinds of analyses, network analysis, Bayesian statistics, are allowing much deeper interrogations of this kind of data. So we're now starting, every paper that's coming out now is going to be about network analysis. These are our last couple of papers. Several of these are from our last few, in which we're basically interrogating the data deeper than we ever used to. Next slide. I'm anticipating, this is future casting, this is where I think that the field is going. The interesting thing is, as soon as you think it's going somewhere, a paper pops up that somebody's already got it out. So a bunch of these papers are, basically from, the last couple of days to last several weeks. What we're anticipating seeing on tagged animals, integration, we're going to start seeing, instead of just an acoustic tag, it's going to be a SAT tag with a built-in acoustic tag. An ADL PSAT is already available. And that company is making it modular, so you can add on different sensors as you go. We anticipate seeing a lot more combined materials, like the Little Leonardo now having the ADL as well. So you've got cameras and acoustic and sonar. I'm anticipating seeing a lot more multi-sensor kind of tags. So you're going to see some lab on a chip kind of things coming out. There's custom silicon being built, currently in, engineering labs. You're going to see that integrated back into tags. Going to see very large scale. Right now, you're starting to see integration of receivers on the scale of a few thousand. I'm anticipating seeing, at some point in time, hundreds of thousands. There was a tuna paper that came out where they had 1,200 data from 1,200 receivers. And I'm anticipating seeing in the next couple of years, you're going to start seeing papers come out with 10,000, 20,000 sensors. I'm anticipating seeing, instead of one Saildrone out there, that you're going to start to see swarms, that they're going to be self-creating arrays, so that they, instead of everybody transmitting up to satellites separately, you're going to see a bunch of them transmitting back and forth to each other, and then one of them uplinking. You're going to see new satellite constellations, Starlink. There was a reconnaissance drone, picture of a reconnaissance drone that washed up on Crimea the other day. And sitting in the back, they didn't say there was a Starlink, but it sort of looked like a Starlink antenna. And when that comes out, that's, you can drop your costs from, to $100 a month for massive amounts of data link. I'm anticipating seeing a lot more of that being used. Reporter tags. I'm anticipating seeing, you're already talking about using animals as sensors. I'm anticipating seeing a lot more tags that talk back and forth. So BEMCO has the one type that detects other acoustic tag fish. I think that pretty soon you're going to see a lot more tags pick up either acoustics or sound, and then transmit back to some sort of a receiver drone on the surface. Right now, there's a artificial intelligence for birds that Cornell is using, BirdNet. And we started talking about that. And the next thing, there was a paper, I think that was 2 days ago, on automated detection of marine animal sounds. So basically using convolution neural net to detect or to pick out and assign whale sounds. You're going to see that a lot faster. You're going to see there's a paper that came out in July using dark fiber optic as a detector using distributed acoustic sensing. You're going to see that gets picked up all over the place, so that every bit of fiber optic that's laid out there has extra cables in it, dark cables. And once somebody figured out that using a simple cheap interrogator you can pick up whale sounds, pretty soon you're going to see those, instead of going out to a hydrophone, it's just going to be a loop of cable, or a cable that's run out already to, say, an oil rig, and somebody can just interrogate unused cable fibers on that cable. That will be, I would anticipate in the Gulf of Mexico within the next year, you're going to see that. So next slide, please. Right now in the Gulf of Mexico, acoustic telemetry and animal telemetry in general has some challenges. There's no strong central actor. For instance, in the Great Lakes, you have GLADOS, you have the Great Lakes Acoustic Telemetry Array. Canada, you have POST. Those are fairly strong central actors. Right now, we have a weak interaction, a volunteer network, ITAG, run by FWCC, thank you very much, that allows for some amount of data interchange. There's no similar structure for satellite tagging. At the moment, your satellite tag, you watch it yourself. You don't know that there might be, say, somebody else's tag critter swimming alongside yours. At least with the acoustic telemetry, you can, send out your unknown tags, somebody else picks them up, and maybe you manage to work together. There's a good data storage for environmental data. It's GECOS, Zecora. You can dig into their networks. There's no easy linkage right now where I can put in a path from a telemetry animal and get back a series of environmental data based on those days. And, as the Saildrone people mentioned, when you get into the spacing between in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a lot of limitations. Next. So these are the references for the papers that we didn't cite show their titles. And basically, if there's any questions, we'd be happy to entertain them.
Thank you. That was very interesting. It's been a while since I was in that realm, and things have changed quite a bit. I mean, obviously, just 12 years ago, I was manual tracking fish, and things have developed quite a bit. And my professor at the time said, if tracking was easy, everybody would be doing it. But this technology has made it a lot easier and accessible to a lot more people, and a lot of people are doing it now. And a lot of questions are being answered, though. So that's good. That's more of a comment than a question, but I don't have any questions necessarily. But does anybody else have questions on the committee or in the audience? I mean, you're the only presenter for this, right? There's not gonna be another.
No, Melissa's here for, she's more the data analysis person. She doesn't.
Right. Sorry.
Want to speak, but if anybody has questions about the network analyses or the, space state kind of questions that you can derive from these things, I'll let her answer them.
Of course.
I have a question.
All right, there you are.
So I have a question. This is Beverly Sauls from Florida FWC. I'm familiar with the ITAG group. You mentioned though that there's nothing similar to that for satellite telemetry. I mean, what do you see that, what would it take to develop something like that?
A lot of it is trust. Even in ITAG, when we were having the initial formation meetings for that, a huge amount of it is trust. How do you put out your data without somebody else going, oh, there's, publicly available data, I think I'll put out a paper on that, because most people, when you're generating telemetry data, you generate a bunch of it, and then you take a couple of years to mull it over and think about it. And you obviously don't want to, have somebody else write a paper about your data while you're still sitting on it and thinking about it, or accumulating enough that you find a paper that you've built enough to have a paper. The catch with the telemetry data, let's say you have a track, of your turtle, you have no idea if there's tuna sharing the same space, right? Or a shark, and these are the questions we can start to answer now with the acoustic telemetry data. Because we are all sharing data back and forth, we can talk to people and say, oh, where are the sharks doing at the same time? Your sharks, what are your sharks doing while my sturgeon are doing this? And if you don't know that that's out there, if you haven't picked up somebody's shark data on your array and sent it back to them, you don't know that you should talk to them and say, hey, let's collaborate. With the telemetry data, you're looking at your individual track, and you can look at all of your tracks, but you can't look at what anybody else's tracks are doing. So it's how to build a safe space, I guess, where everybody agrees on what the rules are so that they can look at each other's data and say, oh, there's something interesting going on here between my data and your data. Let's talk and put out a collaborative paper.
Or some aggregate data.
Or some amount of aggregate data, you know. I don't know if that entirely answers your question.
Yeah, I know it's difficult to get everybody to play nice together for those reasons. I'm just wondering if it maybe would require some sort of a data sharing agreement where people would upload their data and then you could see a map of, you know, where things have been
Exactly.
close to yours, and then establish the positions or the permissions for that, you know, through some sort of, you know, agreement when you upload that data.
Right, exactly. And that also gives you, right now in the Gulf Sturgeon community, one of the things we've been doing with some NRDA funding has been building a large database repository for all of the individual researchers' data over years, which gives you some safety, because when somebody retires, if you don't have a data repository for their data, what happens to it? You know, and that's a question that, you know, we've started having to ask, you know, in terms of like this telemetry data. You know, if you know, a working lifespan for a professor or, you know, a researcher, individual researcher is 10 to 20 years, then where does that data go if you don't have some sort of a large, you know, database repository, you know, and that ties back into that same safe space concept.
Along those same lines, I worked with someone who had trust issues also, but it was sharing data. I never understood it, and you know, we got pings and stuff we didn't share, and I was agreeing to that, you know. But I mean, is there any precedent? Has anybody really? I can't imagine taking someone's pings here and there and trying to put together a paper on it. Is there anybody who's ever? I mean, no naming names, but has anybody ever done that?
In the Atlantic sturgeon world, apparently it has happened. There was a kerfuffle a few years back, and that has spilled over into some trust issues for certain researchers, shall we say.
It has happened with satellite telemetry also. There was a site called seaturtle.org where people publicly displayed maps, and that's exactly what happened. Someone took the fact that it was publicly displayed as a approval to use those data, and not the raw data, but to include maps and say like other species have used this area before those data were available. So that's the challenge.
All right, we have another question from the audience here. Tony Reisinger.
About, you mentioned Starlink earlier, and if you put Starlink uplinks and downlinks, don't you need a larger dish? And how would that impact some of these Saildrones? Or do you need the dish at all?
So that antenna right now is about 16 by, I think it's 28 or 30, which, you know, fits onto a kayak size or sailboard size drone, whatever you want to call it, quite easily. And so, you know, if you, you know, what I anticipate seeing in the future is a lot of homemade kayak, trolling motor, battery setups that basically, you know, you could condense down to, say, a $5,000 unit, you know, homegrown, running up high, and somebody just launches it and it puts its way out there very slowly and steadily and stays out for several weeks and comes back. And, you know, the trend of things as far as lighter weight, higher battery density, you're going to start seeing these things pop up on their own. And somebody's going to be slapping, you know, like I said, a Starlink antenna on the back and having their own up and down link pretty easily.
Interesting. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank you for your presentation. We're going to move on. We're going to do the next round of our general session, and we have some time. We have 3 presentations. They're about 30 minutes, but we have Doug Myers, and he's going to talk about applying machine learning to oyster reef monitoring in Chesapeake.
Good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Doug Myers. I'm the Maryland Senior Scientist for Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And I'm going to go a little bit through the backstory of how we got to this. Chesapeake Bay Foundation is a non-governmental organization, a little different from many of your agencies that you might work with. But we have been doing oyster restoration in the Chesapeake Bay for about 25 years. And we're integrated very well with the researchers, with the state and federal agencies that are doing stock assessment and restoration. And so we're able to be a trusted entity to pull together data sources and new technologies and learn from where we were. Interestingly, that Mike mentioned the trust issue. That's something that comes up early and often and has to be integrated with your system. So it's not just a hardware problem. It's definitely a data problem, a sharing data problem, and a collaboration model, I would say. I think it's an opportunity. So starting with a nice, clear, relatively picture of an oyster reef ball in the Chesapeake. Conditions like this occur about once or twice a year for about 15 minutes. So you have to have your camera ready to get that kind of a shot. There are some underwater photographers around the Chesapeake who literally just track conditions every day to see when they can get in the water and get images. So we have to find a better way to monitor what's going on under the water. Chesapeake Bay Foundation has been doing, as I said, restoration mostly with spat on shell, which are deployed by a vessel that we bought here in the Gulf down in Louisiana, and brought it up and put a crane on it and put a conveyor belt down the middle and a salt spreader on the front end to be able to put thin layers of spat on shell on top of a prepared reef substrate. And the reason we do it that way is that because since about 1972, when Hurricane Agnes swept through the Chesapeake, large-scale sedimentation happens on most of our reefs, and if they aren't high enough off the bottom, they disappear within a couple of years. And so a lot of the restoration of oyster reefs, historic oyster reefs, needs some substrate preparation first. We also do an oyster gardening program, which is a great way to introduce members of the public to the oyster resource. It's surprising how many people don't know of oysters other than what looks like on the half shell in a restaurant. And that includes the engineers you might be working with to do oyster restoration reef monitoring. This is a kind of a layout of some of the sites that Chesapeake Bay Foundation has been doing restoration on. These precede the location of sanctuary reefs, which were established both in Maryland and Virginia. There's about 100 sanctuary reefs now across the bay that are out of bounds for commercial fishing. Those generally were the worst areas that used to hold oysters that have already been harvested that the watermen didn't want anymore. And so most of the time they required active restoration in order to do any kind of recovery of the oyster reef resource. And our project is really focused on oyster reef restoration. We're not into populations or production. And so everything I'll be talking about is to monitor the development and change in oyster reefs in sanctuary areas for their fisheries and biological contributions, as well as their water quality contributions, because of the large amount of filtration capacity that oysters provide in these tributaries. This is what a typical restoration tributary looks like. This entire area is in sanctuary, so it's off limits to harvest. Just for orientation, the most offshore portion of this tributary is that section 5, and then you go up toward 1 to the more upstream tributaries, and then each one is blown up. I wanted to show this slide so you got an idea for what the distribution of reefs looks like. These are all historically active reefs. Many of them are at best hard bottom with silt over top when we went in there to start to restore them. So there were many metric tons of rock brought in to be able to build a reef restoration base on, and then spat on shell placed on top of those. There was a way that was determined by the state-federal partnership that you were going to get all your monitoring data. And part of that was to be able to include watermen in the process by hiring them for the day to do surveys, either with hand tongs or patent tongs, to be able to take samples, and then those samples were analyzed. And this is kind of what I call where we were before we started this project. There's some pros of this kind of sampling. You get good comprehensive metrics of the density per square meter of the bay bottom on that little place where you sampled. And you have some good length frequency of measured oysters, and we shuck the meat, we send it to the lab, we get biomass estimates. The problem is you could be out there all day long and not really cover much geographic area doing licks of a patent tong. You kind of do destroy the reef structure. So if you kind of depended on that in a sanctuary area and you continue to go back and sample the same places to see change over time, pretty much you're going to destroy the reef that you're trying to rebuild. These reefs, because of the sedimentation rate, do not build vertically very quickly, and so we didn't want to do unnecessary destructive sampling. Much of the sampling techniques were really for population estimates, and they were fine for that purpose. To look at, oysters per square meter and then do some math to figure out what your population was. But it wasn't really good for looking at other reef dynamics that are important to us. And then you had a lot of time either on board or separate lab analysis to get to the real questions that you want. Now, I sound disparaging about this, but it's really important that all this data exists because it was the foundation of where we went with our remote sensing ideas. And then just to show you what a good day underwater in the Chesapeake looks like. It's pretty green, it's pretty hazy, and you can put your square meter transect down. We're very jealous of the folks who are from Virginia South because you have intertidal reefs and you can throw your transect square down on a low tide and count everything up and collect it. Most of the reefs in the Maryland section of the bay start around -6 feet and go to about -25 feet. So you're not going to be able to sample that way. You need to be underwater. You need to be able to remotely sense those reefs. So one of our volunteers actually came up with this idea. He was very aware of the issue and said, there's got to be a better way to get underwater photography in the bay. And so the idea of putting a clear water lens between the camera lens and the bottom objective was identified in concept. And he drew this. And so we started looking around for money. It's like, okay, who's going to build us one of these things? This little remote sensing camera that we can drop off the back of a boat. What we ended up with was this, the Clearwater box. The Clearwater box has about 10 gallons of distilled water inside that apron between the lens of the camera and the window on the bottom of the box. The floats there are for counterbalancing. The thing weighs about 120 pounds in the air, and then it's pretty much neutrally buoyant in the water. But it is diver assisted, and basically in the conditions in the Chesapeake for much of the year, all that you see is what you can see through the LCD screen viewing port. There is no visibility to the bottom, even if you're about 2 or 3 feet off the bottom. So the diver has to be able to float over the reef and follows a 100-meter transect. And this is what we've been doing for about 6 or 7 years now. It's pretty amazing. The viewports on the side allow for both movie lights and strobes to be attached to it. And so we can do a 100-meter transect video, and then we can come back and take on 10-meter points, take a good high-quality image with the strobes. This is Nick Kalianis and Clarita Berger. They work for Maryland Public Television and are also freelance videographers who've put together underwater camera systems for work all over the world, and very lucky to have them in Baltimore and collaborating on this project. The best visibility is going to be in the middle of the winter, so we go out there, Nick puts on his dry suit, and it's super cold water, and that's best conditions we can get. But we will, we'll be able to get some pretty clear water images even at the bottom of Baltimore Harbor, which is probably our cloudiest place. This is the bottom of Baltimore Harbor. We're able to get the substrate preparation, and then after the rocks have been laid. We get some really good bird's eye views because the box itself is neutrally buoyant and can hover over the surface of the reef. And it's able to be blown up, those images, so you can get to finer scale detail. We're even able to see some of the seagrasses that are coming in along the transect that might be associated with the reef. This kind of detail was just kind of unknown before. It was just not able to be seen, and we're able to really characterize this. Now, the one difficulty with this is somebody has to look at all this video, somebody has to look at all these pictures. It's a great project for interns. It's like, okay, tell us what you've seen on each image. The one thing that's nice is as we set this up, this was a really good head start for the project that I'm going to talk about next, is that we had a geodatabase in our GIS system for those reef polygons like what you saw before. They were all mapped. That was a state data layer that went back many years, but they're pretty large areas of what was historically hard bottom. And they actually mapped those in like the 1930s just by dragging a chain behind a boat. And if a chain moved, they considered it hard bottom and they map it as such. So they were really kind of squishy boundaries to those things. So as we're able to come back and get more detailed information from these transects, we can use those state reef boundaries and then put much more detailed information directly over top of our geodatabase of those map polygons. Last thing I'll say about the Clearwater box is, again, you can magnify the image and not lose the scale, so you're able to take those stills in particular and bring them up to places where you can count individual oysters and look at mortality and things like that in situ. Last thing is, again, this is Fort Carroll Reef. It's the bottom of Baltimore Harbor, someplace we thought we would never either be able to build an oyster reef or that it would survive or reproduce, and it's doing all those things. It's one of our most productive restoration reefs because it's right next to the Baltimore Ship Channel. It gets salinity and lots of good wave action from the passing ships, and tends to be a pretty good place to grow oysters, it turns out. But we would have never known that if we didn't have the Clearwater box to go and verify. We've been doing oyster dumps there with the oyster gardening program for about 25 years, but it's only been the last 5 that we've actually seen them in situ. Okay, now that the Clearwater box baby steps are done, we still have the thing. It's sitting in collecting dust right now. We're kind of trying to think what we do with it next, but it was really important for us to gather some imagery, and there's been other folks who've been able to use in Virginia, where the water's a little bit clearer, some GoPro rigs to take a look at imagery. And it's very important to have as much imagery as you can to teach an infant computer what oysters look like, because computers are quick, but they're not that smart. So once you teach them what an oyster looks like versus a rock or bare bottom and things like that, and that artificial intelligence requires thousands and thousands of images. So we were able to work with a group of University of Maryland computing students who were able to start training the artificial intelligence what oysters look like and what the patterns of oysters look like from photographic images, which was really important for them to be able to detect oysters. And then we also deployed some of our new sensors on places that already had that physical sampling data from previous methods, so that we knew what the densities were, we knew what the height off the bottom was, we knew what the biomass was. So it's easy to teach a computer what an oyster looks like. It's harder to teach an engineer what an oyster looks like, because again, they were mostly familiar with the half shell version. They did not understand how oyster reefs grew and what they look like and how deep they were. So we spent a lot of words putting together kind of some, one they love acronyms, so we came up with platform, the prototype literal aquatic trainer for oyster reef restoration monitoring. So once they had an acronym, they were able to look at the rest of it, and they would kind of compartmentalize like an engineer's brain does. Things like frequency of sampling, the depth, boundaries, the bathymetry resolution that you needed, what kind of bottom mapping were you looking at? Because they've been, we working with Northrop Grumman, they're used to doing all this stuff in the deep ocean and super clear water. They have never done any of this stuff in less than 25 feet of water with cloudy conditions. And so just to give you an idea, cost came up a while back, and it's like, so we had some 5 or 6 years with the Clearwater box to say, okay, we've done a bunch of contracts with this diver. We kind of understand those costs and those risks. The costs were about $7,000 a day to deploy the dive boat, the diver, and the videographers. And the risk was that diver could be raked across an oyster reef by strong currents or sucked up off the bottom by a passing ship. And it was dangerous, in addition to being very cold water and things like that. So the last time we had a Clearwater box survey on one of our most high profile reefs, the diver did slit his dry suit. Luckily, it was just a surface flesh wound. He didn't get his spleen or anything else while it was happening, but the oysters are super sharp, as you know, and you really don't want somebody down there in completely dark conditions where the only thing they can see of the oysters is through the LCD screen. So we learned a lot from the Clearwater box experience of like why we would rather send a robot down. You know, as a nonprofit organization, I think one bad accident could wipe us out with the insurance. So we didn't really want to risk Clearwater box use in those conditions anymore. So I mentioned GoPro rigs. These are way cheaper, but you have the ability to deploy them only on a couple days of the year, usually in the middle of the winter, but it's safer. You don't have to have a diver. And this is how we collected a lot of imagery, not just Chesapeake Bay Foundation, but NOAA, Chesapeake Bay Office, and the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center were using these rigs simultaneously and gathering lots of imagery across a lot of parts of the bay to help train the artificial intelligence. This is what one looks like going into the water. It has cameras at a couple different places to catch the reef at different angles, and then some, you know, simple water quality monitoring data. Usually can attach those with zip ties as well. SERC, Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, worked hard at looking at these images and characterizing the oyster reefs they've seen through them into a 0 through 3 scale, which is super important for us. If you guys are familiar with side scan sonar, looking at oyster reefs, at best you can get your on reef or your off reef. And our dive master who ran the Clearwater box had a great, very technical term that he used for when we were on reef. He called them squiggly doos. So if you're over squiggly doos in the side scan sonar, you're probably over some kind of a reef. But that's really the best kind of classification we had, was squiggly doos or not. And so even to find a good place to deploy the Clearwater box where we know we'd actually see reef was based on doing some side scan sonar surveys first. Now the CERC scale I think is really pretty interesting. It's very simple. A 0 scale would be no oysters at all. A 1 scale would be less than 50% coverage, and you could have to look at a lot of images to get a feel for that and to put those on there accurately. A number 2 scale reef would be more than 50% coverage and less than 1 adult oyster high. These are probably our best reefs that are out there that have not been restored, because there's been, you know, 150 years of oyster dredging over most of our reefs, and so they have no vertical profile left at all and lots of sedimentation. And so if you had a scale 2 reef, you were pretty happy. And that would be really important. And then our best reefs, which we're usually only seeing in ones that have had millions of dollars of restoration on them, over 50% cover and more than 1 oyster high. Now, this scale was super important for not just determining how we would grade the oyster reefs from the artificial intelligence, but also These are our restoration targets. If you're looking at a scale 2 reef, it probably had enough oysters to keep pace with sea level rise, but in a lot of cases, those oyster reefs could benefit from additional spat-on-shell plantings because in a lot of cases, they were single-aged oysters from one planting. And so to get a second year class on them so that you'd have more male and female ratio for reproduction usually would help. And that would be the restoration target for scale 2 reefs. The restoration target for scale 1 would be placing substrate like you saw in Baltimore Harbor and then adding spat-on-shell on top. Our scale 3 reefs we would leave alone and just monitor them to make sure they weren't getting buried with sediment or dying from diseases. And then the zeros were like, don't waste your time. Anything you pour in there will just sink into the mud. So that was really important for us to decide, okay, if we're going to rapidly scan a reef with some kind of remote sensing device, is it going to be able to target and quickly identify and map our restoration targets for us? This is the Sperry Star. This is Northrop Grumman's very expensive sailing yacht that's for research of all kinds, most of which they can't tell us about. It's interesting working with a military contractor. We have a very guarded conversations. We can talk about oysters all day long. We can talk about some of the things this boat can do, and then we get to a point where we can't talk about that. But we also have a very big challenge in sending data back and forth. Chesapeake Bay Foundation can send Northrop Grumman data all day long. If Northrop Grumman sends us anything, it has to be encrypted a couple different ways. And so we don't always have the ability to decrypt things as easily as they can when they're passing data to each other. And so that's been an ongoing challenge. But the Sperry Star is a great stable platform for testing new hardware. And the reason that is eventually we get to something that's miniaturized and we can use off of a small skiff. But the early beta versions of those technologies are usually pretty big and clunky and have a lot of wires associated with them, requiring a huge amount of power. And so we really needed a stable platform to be able to do this. We also did a lot of work in the lab with tanks. This was the first and most failed from Chesapeake Bay Foundation's perspective. This is a laser LiDAR system that was able to see all kinds of great things in a tank. It couldn't see anything in Chesapeake Bay. As a matter of fact, the lasers don't work below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So while we were out there in the wintertime trying to get our best water clarity conditions, the lasers froze up and wouldn't work. Engineers, being engineers, would take their hand warmers that they had, the little, chemical hand warmers, and they'd wrap the lasers around the hand warmers to warm them up to above 50 degrees so that they could even shoot them into the water so that they could see that they didn't work. The cool thing is, while this didn't work at all for Chesapeake Bay Foundation's purposes, it worked great for Northrop Grumman because as they were developing this platform, they decided that, well, it doesn't work very well for oysters, but it works really well for some of our other military applications we're not allowed to talk to you about. So they went off, the LiDAR team went off and developed some secret squirrel military hardware with it, and they thanked us for the opportunity to think about it that way, but we've not seen that team ever since. But that's something that, Northrop Grumman gets something for their investment. This is what that looks like on the back of the Sperry Star. Lots of laptops open, lots of wires going everywhere, lots of people bundled up, and then the lasers not working. The next one, very easy. Many of you probably worked with side scan sonar. This is an off-the-shelf tow fish that we can drag behind the boat. The real beauty of this is after you mosaic the image, the artificial intelligence is actually applying this scale of 0, 1, 2, and 3 to the image. So at whatever scale you choose, you're going to get a classified image of the reef at whatever scale you tow it. So if you imagine back when I showed you the individual reef polygons that were in that restoration tributary, those each can be scanned and made a mosaic image that can be printed on top of your geodatabase polygon at a much higher resolution than we had before, including not just what is reef and what isn't reef, but 3 different kinds of reef are now able to be viewed on the same geodatabase. The next sensor is a hydrophone. It's actually a series of 3 hydrophone buoys. These are off the shelf, but they are off the very top shelf. They're really expensive hydrophones. They're only available from Germany. We would not have been able to afford buying these things without Northrop Grumman's help. As a matter of fact, it was a combination of Northrop Grumman's philanthropic arm and the Palmer Foundation that put their money together to buy these things. They are super sensitive in being able to hear a number of frequencies and for fairly long ranges. This is what an oyster reef sounds like. I could fall asleep to this. The computer doesn't hear, and if it does hear, it doesn't know what to do with noises. But a computer can take the spectrograph of that recording, and it can do all kinds of stuff with it. And so as we're learning with this, we have a couple things, decibels of the power of the sound, the frequency of the sound, and then for how long each frequency gets expressed creates like the shape of the sound. And that complexity, known to the computer as just this spectrogram, can apply what it's learning, because the machine's always learning, that there's probably maybe, let's say 4 different categories of sound complexity that would basically within the entire experience of the computer as it's learning, it could break it up into 4 random categories based on complexity. And then we can go back and see, does that match with what we're thinking about 0, 1, 2, and 3 categories of visual cover for the oysters? Or we could do it the other way. We could just take it to where we know there's a 3, and we can deploy it there, and we could say, this is what a 3 sounds like. Then we can take it to a 2. This is what a 2 sounds like. This is what a 1 sounds like. This is what a 0 sounds like. Zeros are very quiet. And in addition to that, the AI is being able to be fed recorded spectrographs from other species that have already been recorded in the lab. A lot of the drums, a lot of the croakers, spot, oyster toadfish, all those kinds of things that make noise in and around the reef are, once the computer knows what that looks like on a spectrograph, it can start making a species list for us as it listens to the things. Everything it detects will be able to be listed and put out there. The computer can remove all the times where the recording has boat noise that would affect it. It would take us hours and hours and hours of listening. The computer can just say anything that looks like that big, loud, noisy thing, cut it out. And so we're able to take a look at reef dynamics by deploying the thing in 3s. We can do a triangular pattern and kind of actually hear things moving from one sensor to the other. And we're able to go deploy these things in places where we really don't have a feel for the oyster resource within a tributary. And so at that tributary scale, deploying them a mile or so apart, we can get a good feel for what's happening in the oyster resource. So different scale than side scan sonar or something that would be visual like the Clearwater box. But very interesting, and we're very excited about this, and you can imagine Northrop Grumman is too. The crackling sound that you heard is snapping shrimp that live down inside the reef. Snapping shrimp don't occur throughout the Chesapeake Bay, but in all the high-profile reefs that we've sampled so far, we are hearing lots of snapping shrimp. And from this, this is unclassified now, so I can tell you about it. The snapping shrimp frequency is of interest to Northrop Grumman because they can use that frequency to actively ping and listen for submarines. And so they've actually already deployed that technology before we started making these recordings. They were aware of snapping shrimp, and basically an Al-Qaeda submarine could come into one of our ports and just ignore what sounds like snapping shrimp, and it's actually Northrop Grumman out there pinging to detect the submarine. So there is some really interesting overlaps where their investment in our work is paying dividends for their work, and that's pretty exciting where we can help each other out. This is what it looks like when you just look at reef versus non-reef. The blue line on the bottom is just, you know, a sand bottom or a mud bottom. What you would hear, there's all kinds of noise happening in the reef areas, and we're able to take a look at, like I said, just the frequencies and the decibels, the power. This came from in situ recordings that were done in Pamlico Sound from NC State. That group of collaborators is well ahead of us in the acoustic space. They've published a number of papers and are collaborating as far as, you know, helping us to figure out what different fish sound like, and using this information not just for detecting and mapping reefs, but the really cool thing that we're looking forward to is they have found, at least in the lab, that playing this sound back of the most complex reefs actually affects larval oyster swimming behavior. They stop swimming, they become negatively buoyant, and they fall out of the water column. So we think we can use this recorded sound as an attractant for any live larvae that are in the water. We're thinking of applying this to places where we have, both Virginia and Maryland have mandatory living shoreline laws, where we have the offshore breakwater as opposed to riprap and bulkheads for most shorelines moving forward. So we have ample opportunity to be able to deploy speakers and attract larvae when there's larvae already swimming in the water. When we know that, we also may be able to put some silk curtains around them and introduce hatchery larvae and make them settle where we want them to. So really interesting potential application of this sensor. And then the last is, you know, a couple times of the year, we can get the visual images, and we're going to use an ROV instead, because that way we don't scratch open dry suits or, you know, scare people or have to put them into cold water. But this is the AI component of this is a light field imaging camera. It's much like the scanner of a 3D printer. And it's on the ROV in addition to a regular video camera. I only have lab images for you to see. This is a medium turbidity tank, where this is what on the left, what a regular video camera would see, but the LFI camera is able to electronically, through an algorithm, dehaze the image and produce a 3D rendering. So this is not just a photograph, but we could basically measure, you know, volume from this rendered image. So this is actually a 3D image. We're playing around. The reason I don't have any good field shots for you yet is we're playing around with the size of the lens, because that determines your depth of field and the size of the field. So there's a trade-off when you're hovering an ROV over a reef, how much of it you want to see versus how well you want to see it. And so that's still in development. The ROV itself is off-the-shelf technology. It has some great ability to station keep. So we're able to hover over the reef, and then just like our Clearwater box diver would, we would just use that 100-meter cable and fly over the reef in a cardinal direction, and that would be our transect. The LFI image, the LFI camera is not actually taking video, it's taking hundreds of frames per second of just, you know, shadows essentially through the haze, and then it's rendering this 3D image. So it's pretty exciting what we're going to be able to do at this scale. It's our finest spatial scale, so we're not going to be deploying it anywhere. We probably will have already done the large scale acoustic surveys with the hydrophones first, then narrowed down and done some side scan sonars that were classified into the reef segments. And then if we really wanted to verify what was down there at any time of the year, we would use this. It would be more sensitive in the wintertime when we do have slightly clear water. And then the acoustic would be better in the summertime when the reef is making noise. So that kind of allows us to have capabilities year round. And then this is the high turbidity tank. Again, you see some weird shadows over there, not quite sure what they are, but this is pretty close up of oyster shells. And we do have some, concerns that this might be too fine of a scale. And so we're trying to get that standoff distance and that, what's the perfect scale to be able to do that kind of work. So that's the end of the slides. I do want to say a couple words about the system that it's going within. I mentioned the trust issue from the standpoint of Chesapeake Bay Foundation being kind of integrated with the agencies and the academic groups. It's really great having Smithsonian there, really right in the middle of us, because they're able to tap not just their own researchers, but a lot of visiting researchers and other collaborators they have throughout the country. Northrop Grumman is interested in taking what we've developed here to Australia, where they have some of the same questions about oyster reefs and some of their estuaries. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation started a couple years ago a group called the Chesapeake Oyster Alliance, and it is a group of researchers, academics, agency folks, and aquaculturists, and as well as nonprofits, to share data together and to encourage each other to publish things as soon as they get them, to share them with each other, even if it's unpublished data, and to kind of build that trust. A lot of it's just asking permission to use data that's out there. A lot of it is taking the next step with data that somebody's already developed. And so it's allowed us to really collaborate much faster. If we had to come up with that 0, 1, 2, 3 scale by ourselves without CERC doing that on the side and saying, yeah, we think it's not only great to use for GoPros, but it works, across the board, however you want to characterize the reef. And wouldn't it be great if we were all characterizing reefs the same way across the Chesapeake? So that Chesapeake Oyster Alliance has an annual science symposium. We just had it a couple weeks ago, where everybody gets together and shares our data for things, not just for reef monitoring, but things like oyster aquaculture innovations and things like that. So very important to think about from the very beginning, how you're going to store your data, how you're going to share your data. One of the things we realized is the file sizes coming off of these machines are big, way bigger than we want to hold on our server. And we don't want to bog down our computers. None of our laptops would work. So we had to buy a special laptop that even has the computing power to receive this data. But then we're using a Microsoft Azure platform, which is a cloud-based computing system that will be able to store the algorithms that are written in Python that I don't even know how to read, but they're creating graphic user interfaces for the CBF staff to be able to program things, deprogram things, and analyze things. All the analysis software will live there, and then it will interface with our GIS geodatabase, so that at any time we can pull down chunks of that data, display it, create a story map, and put it out on our website to share pieces of it, so that folks can get that. The whole idea is, by the time this is all done, we will have spent the money. Northrop Grumman spent about $500,000 in research and development funds for this under their engineering challenge, and they're excited about doing the next step. They want to really get into sub-bottom profiling next, because there's a lot of buried shell with all that sedimentation, and shell is our main resource that is in short supply, both for restoration and for aquaculture. So that's all I have, and any questions?
Well, thanks, Doug. That was really interesting. There's a lot, I'm sure there's some questions. I have a couple of Rick.
Appreciate the presentation. It's very interesting. Question, does this intelligence, does it pick up or differentiate between different size classes, oysters, seed, spat, etc.?
That's what we're trying to figure out, what resolution we want the light field imaging camera to do. What we're focusing on is just going back to the places where we already have that information, and then that's where we're going to film. So we know that at least that if we have size class information, density, and biomass, we can kind of feed that into all those things that make up a 3. And the characterizations, we're going to use this for rapid characterization. We're not using this for population dynamics. So if we want to know where to put the next increment of restoration money, this is going to do the job. It's not going to substitute for a physical sample where you need the population dynamics.
I thought the acoustic study was really interesting with the sound. When you all were doing that, there's a lot of variables when you look at this, data. You have, I mean, you did restoration reefs too. I mean, could you tell?
That's all we do is
okay.
restoration
So
reefs,
these are all restoration reefs, but do you know if, like, say a fresh restoration versus one that's been sitting there and it's got a lot of sediment on it, and like the biotics that are there that are making the sound are going to change over time, seasonally, even diurnal,
right?
Dial changes,
yeah,
in sound.
So very little data in so far. We definitely realize that just getting it out there while the reef is making noise was first. Get a data stream going. Going across that season is our next step. And we'll probably go back to those same places so we get a feel for that variability first before we go to lots of different places. The reef where we're calling it R3 and we have our most complex acoustic data set right now is about 8 years old. And it's probably the oldest restoration reef of its size and scale in the Chesapeake because of when restoration started. All of the what we call Johnny Oyster seed projects that we've gone back either with the Clearwater box or this technology to monitor have already been silted over, and pretty much there just wasn't enough restoration effort applied to a system that's been essentially mowed down and sedimented over. So unless we had the entire data set of baseline to placement of substrate to several different spat on shell placements and like 1, 3, and 6 year monitoring with physical sampling, we would have no idea how any of that stuff works. This is baseline from the standpoint of what we're able to hear acoustically and look at biodiversity in that way. So we hope that going back to those same reefs a couple years later, we'll find even more. I do have to mention one other very kind of fun little data set is each year we have what's called the Rod and Reef Slam, where we send fishermen out for a week to go fishing on these restoration reefs. And not like your typical fishing tournament, we don't care how big the fish are, we want to know how many species you caught. And so, yes, one Sunday, we logged 13 species from one of these reefs, which we thought was pretty amazing. Each year we go back and add another species or two as we do that tournament. Yeah, until we start listening over time periods and getting changes, there's a couple of fish like black drum that are, we really want to hear them. And until we hear them, we're not going to consider that reef mature. And so we're getting close to, having enough complexity in the sound and being able to recognize enough species that the reef is getting more complex over time. You have to realize all this data, if we just put it out in the public, would be the perfect blueprint for how to poach, because all of those sanctuaries are kind of protected on paper and they're protected by the Natural Resources Police in both states, but they can't be everywhere all the time. We do find that the reefs that are closest to the sanctuary boundary are being poached. And so we don't want to assume that that growth is continuous and it's not being interrupted. So we want to make sure we're kind of going well into the interior of these sanctuaries where it's unlikely to be poached, and that the only thing is happening is time is the only change. And we're really excited because the computer doesn't have the biases we do, and so if it's hearing more complexity over time, that's a real effect. that we can attribute, and change over time is one of the things we're most excited about the potential for this to be able to do, because it doesn't have the biases of like, okay, what do I look at? It's like we've chosen up front. You're not going to look at anything. You're going to listen, and that's going to be what changes. We may not be able to detect either through side scan sonar or the LFI images something like change over time, but the acoustics are going to be, I think, really important for that.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, what is and I may have missed it, you may have covered it, the size of these restoration reefs that you're monitoring with the camera? And
yeah, the smallest ones are like a reef itself, not the complex. The smallest ones are about an acre, and they range up to about 10 or 12 acres. And so that whole map I showed you of all the different complexes of reefs together are about 135 acres. And that Harris Creek, that tributary, is now the largest oyster restoration project in the world. It will soon be replaced by the next tributary we do, which will be about 300 acres. So we're doing this an acre at a time over the course of a decade to get back a reef complex that was there historically.
So with that, the camera, I know there's some limiting factors. I know it's not exact, but what is the goal, a daily goal? Maybe not in acres, but like if you have this cluster of these 1 to 10 acre reefs, I mean, how much can you actually survey, and not necessarily survey on the back end too, with the processes, like you said? I mean, what is a realistic daily or weekly goal, however y'all break that down?
Right. So we're gonna listen first, because that's the largest spatial scale, and say, okay, we're either hearing nothing or we're hearing ones only, and we can deploy those. Those are overnight. You throw the buoys in overnight. They're collecting 5 minutes of sound every hour for 12 hours. Download that, the computer can wash it right away and give you that score for what it's heard. You can move that set of 3 buoys up and down a fairly large tributary in a couple of days. So that's the initial survey that we're going to use. We'll have areas that are of interest because we have historic data on bottom hardness and things like that. That along with the acoustic data, will then deploy the side scan sonar. It takes an hour or two to cover one of those reef complexes, and then in the lab we can mosaic the data and have it classified right away. And then for the LFI camera, the battery lasts about 90 minutes. So whatever we can see in 90 minutes, we generally would go inside one of those reef complexes where we already have the side scan sonar data, and we would basically use that for ground truthing.
So in saying all that, it sounds like 3 steps. So and you may not have this, but do you have a ballpark figure for price per acre?
Yeah, price. No, I mean, because all this hardware was put together with grants, the goal for Northrop Grumman is to make both the hardware and software lists available. Here's what we bought. Here's the open source, encrypted Python stuff. Go out other estuaries and buy it. We're not there yet. So I hope to be able to report that after the next year, because once we're starting to do it off the back of our boat, the prices are minimal for us. It's serving our purpose at the scale that we're doing restoration and at the speed we're doing restoration, because we basically go to the next tributary that is of interest for restoration. It's already in a sanctuary. We've already got the permits to do restoration of a certain size, and then we'll gather that baseline data the season before we would actually start doing construction. So that's how we intend to put this in rotation. Because the system lives with us, there's no reason why any other group within the Chesapeake who wants to borrow it, to be able to do the same thing. It's not rocket science to deploy it once it exists. The biggest thing is kind of analyzing and post-processing the data, and that's the piece that Northrop Grumman is like writing, Python script for dummies, ways for us to do that, to program it and to post-process it quickly so that we can get the decision-making done on it. Again, we're not going down to individual oyster size at this point. We kind of already know that because It's whatever we've put out there. The growth rate is pretty, if we put out, a spat, it's going to be an inch long after the first year and 2 inches long after the second year, things like that. So, and there's tons of physical sampling data that show those dynamics, but for the where we put the reef, how big we make the reef, and where we're going to have the biggest success with that investment is what we're going to be able to answer pretty rapidly compared to all that physical sampling we used to have to do.
All right, thanks, Doug. If anybody else has any more questions, you can catch up with them at the.
I'll be at lunch if you guys want to talk later.
Yeah. We're gonna move on to the next talk. We got mapping and remote sensing for oysters in Texas, and Emma Clarkson's going to give that presentation. She's here in person as well.
Thank you, Darren. Hello, everybody. My name is Emma Clarkson. I'm with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's Coastal Fisheries Division. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sonar and acoustics, and with a little bit of background information for those of you who aren't super familiar with it. So obviously the reason we're doing mapping is because we need to identify the extent and monitor changes in oyster habitat, pretty standard resource management challenges that we have there. We need to know if we're losing oyster habitat where, so we can prioritize restoration sites. It is very turbid in Texas, and so it necessitates the use of sonar, side scan sonar, and echo sounders because aerial imagery can't be used to assess deep water reefs in Texas. The caveat is when I say deep water reefs, it's really less than 5 meters in all of our bays in Texas. So it's really a shallow deep water reef, still too deep for aerial imagery, but also too shallow for really efficient use of sonar. So we have to have really tight line spacing. It takes a lot more time than your typical, 10 meter, 15 meter deep bay. So we use 2 approaches, which I'm going to talk about today. Scientific sonar, so your typical multi-beam swath, your edge tech for these bay-wide or system-wide surveys, but we also use recreational sonar for rapid assessments, and I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about that. This is our survey vessel. It's a twin outboard Boston whaler. We have a bow-mounted EdgeTech 6205S, which is a swath side scan sonar bathymetry system. And on the side, we have a single beam echo sounder, a Biosonics DTX 120 kilohertz. And we use both of those pieces of information to inform our habitat mapping. And I'm going to dive into the background a little bit on that for those of you who aren't familiar. So we have that scientific unit, and then we also have a suite of recreational units on our skiffs, typically hummingbirds and garmins that we can use. So the little bit of background information about the difference in the type of information you get from a side scan and an echo sounder. Most people are very familiar with side scan sonars because that's what's going to create your image of the seafloor. It looks just like a picture, just taken with sound. This is an uncalibrated piece of information. So basically in this image, dark means hard and light means soft. So you can look at this and say the black is darker than the white, or the black is harder than the white. So that's probably an oyster reef, but you can't necessarily compare the absolute values of those pixels between survey days. So it's really hard to run automated classifications on those because those pixel values kind of don't really mean anything other than more or less hard. So basically what it is, it's a very, very thin slice of sound that goes out to either side of the boat to a very, very long range, and it reflects the sound back to it, and that is the backscatter, and it tells you how hard or soft. And so on the right, you can see an image of an oyster restoration. The big white swath in the middle is mud, and then here you have oyster reef, and then here you have mounds from an oyster restoration. As compared to the information that you get from single beam echo sounders or fish finders. So if you're a fisheries acoustician, you're probably more familiar with this. This is used for a lot of stock assessments or fish biomass assessments. Compared to this wide swath of a side scan, this is a very small cone with a very small field of view that goes directly underneath the boat. This is calibrated information. And so in fisheries work, you can calibrate the target strength of a specific species and know, oh, when the SV is this number, I know that's a red drum. But you can also do the same for habitat. You can calibrate it to have exact readings for different habitat types. And many of you are probably familiar with your typical recreational fish finder. This is an echo sounder. a little graphic just to understand. So your pulse of sound goes down through the water, hits objects. There's your fish finder, bounces off, goes back to the boat, and then it does the same thing for the seafloor. So that's the principle of backscatter. As the pulse of sound returns to the boat for an echo sounder, this is what I mean when it's calibrated. You have this is the fingerprint of the pulse of sound. It is a very specific value of SV, the velocity, the strength of the sound, and you can see where it hits the bottom and returns back, and you can look at the strength of that signal, and that can tell you something about how loud the bottom is or how hard it is, because harder bottoms return more sound. And then if the sound kind of bounces around and bounces back and forth between the bay bottom and the boat, you can tell more about the sound by that. So for example, if you have an oyster reef and it's very, very rough, the sound goes around, bounces around all of the reef and comes back, and that creates a very specific signal that you can look at it called roughness or rugosity, and you can see that in an echo sounder. Same thing for hardness. If it's a very hard bottom, it'll bounce back with a lot more energy. So basically, at a very minimum, you're looking at how hard the bottom is and how rugose the bottom is to identify oyster habitat, in addition to the imagery you get from the side scan. And I'll show some examples of that in a bit, or right here. So what you see here is on the bottom is the actual imagery from a side scan. So you can see the oyster reefs, and then you can see the single beam echo sounder laid on top of that, which is point data. In this case, it's showing hardness. So the very hard features are blue. So you can look at this and you can say, this looks like an oyster reef and it's also hard. It's probably an oyster reef. And then you do the same thing with rugosity. That's just a little bit of background information. On the right here, you can see side scan image of reef mounds for a restoration site. So you have side scan imagery on the right and an echo sounder on the left. So you can actually see these are both hard, and you can see how red they are, and they're rough because you can see this huge tail underneath of it. So that gives you the two pieces of information you need to discern like between oyster habitat and just a hard clay bed or something like that. So first I'm going to briefly talk about using sonar for oyster restoration, and then I'm going to talk about system-wide mapping. So briefly going over the process for an oyster restoration project in Texas, first we have to identify areas that have lost substrate and are degraded. So we're really targeting things that are shell hashy. We want to make sure they were once historically oyster reef. We're not really in the business of creating new oyster habitat, but we want it to be degraded enough that it actually needs restoration. And so we're kind of looking for these areas that have been pulverized into shell hash, but they also can't be too muddy or else the culture will just sink. So you need firm bottoms. And so we use the single beam echo sounders and the side scan to kind of get us that information. Obviously, there's a whole suite of metrics that we also look at that I'm not going to talk about today because they don't have anything to do with remote sensing, but like water quality and in situ sampling for oyster growth and things like that. So for our site selection survey, what we actually do is we often use recreational sonar to help identify a suite of priority sites for restoration. So we use hummingbirds and Garmins. The reason is that they're very, very low cost. You can put them on all of your skiffs, which means you have a suite of vessels available to you, and they're very quick to mobilize. So rather than getting that big old Boston whaler that I showed you out across the coast, you can have 10 skiffs with side scan sonars on them rapidly mobilizing to your site, so you can survey a lot of areas at once. The quality of the imagery isn't great, and I'll show you that if you're really doing big areas. There's kind of a trade-off between range and resolution. So if you're covering a lot of ground, the imagery is not great. If you spend more time, the imagery is better. But you can cover, 10 sites in a day and prioritize them for coming back later with a scientific suite and kind of getting better imagery at the site. So this is an example of a low quality imagery from a recreational unit. We were just covering as much ground as possible, basically just trying to find, is there oyster reef in this area? It was a part of the bay that had never been mapped, so we didn't have any sonar to rely back on. And so we were able to identify that there is oyster reef here. It's dark as the oyster reef, and these are mud channels. And so it was 200, 300 acres that we knocked out fairly quickly with the recreational unit. And then we went back with the scientific equipment to kind of hone in on the area that we wanted to restore. So you can see obviously the resolution's better, but we needed to kind of know where in the bay to go first. The great thing about recreational units is that they also have single beam echo sounders. So I think a lot of people use them just for the side scan capabilities, but you can actually export the single beam echo sounder data as a CSV and you get soundings depth, and you can actually interpolate that into bathymetric rasters. And so we made topo bathymetry maps of our restoration sites, which is really critical when it comes to restoration planning. And I'll show you that in a second for navigational clearance and water depth. And so you can actually get pretty good, again, rough, non-scientific bathymetry from your hummingbirds and your Garmins. And there's your interpolated bathymetric map from a recreational unit. And this is an example of a better image. So this is one that we had a little bit tighter line spacing, reduced the range on the side scan, spent a little bit more time in a smaller area to get a good image. This is from a recreational unit, and you can see really consolidated, hard, oyster reef. This is just solid oyster reef, but you can also see the texture here. You can see that this is kind of a patchy mosaic, and you can even see where it's a little bit denser and a little bit sparser in the reef, and that was all with a recreational unit. So it really provided imagery that kind of supported our restoration planning of, where needed it the most, where it was consolidated versus unconsolidated. So we use that information to inform a restoration site planning. Obviously, side scan sonar is used to give us the substrate extent, so the footprint of where the restoration will go, and the information from the echo sounder gives us what our navigational clearance can be in an area preliminarily before we get in there with the scientific unit. But we also do need to do in situ sampling to inform restoration design, because obviously we don't have a sub-bottom profiler, so we have to do depth of refusal, the old stick a stick in the mud method to see how much mud or sediment overlay there is on the reefs, and then live oyster abundance sampling. That's an in situ method to make sure we're not smothering live oysters, to make sure the reef actually is degraded and it has a decreased abundance of live oysters. So we use the sonar data that we collected from our hummingbirds to kind of inform the sampling designs for our in situ surveys. And so we have our side scan and our bathymetry, and we go out and get dredges, hydraulic patent tongs, or diver quadrats, and look in an area to assess oyster abundance. And then, those colors didn't come out very well, but this is, again, that Todd's dump site. We use it to inform where we should get our depth soundings, or our depth of refusal soundings for sediment overlay. And you can see the really consolidated reefs have very little sediment on top of them. And then the white areas are mud, and those are just big, deep mud holes. So every time we do an oyster restoration in Texas, if we have the flexibility, we try to design it in an experimental way so that it could be studied if people had monitoring fundings. And so this is an example of one of them. We take our culch for this project and we place them in flats versus mounds. So flats are your typical gonna broadcast a uniform 3-inch layer, try to get as much acreage as I possibly can, but it's fairly low vertical relief, versus the mounding technique where you kind of create these 2-foot high vertical relief mounds. So it takes a little bit more material and it's a little bit more expensive. And so we really want to design our reefs in a way that they can serve as research if somebody wanted to. And typically we pair with academia and they go out and do monitoring studies for their grad students on these reefs. So this is really where the sonar came to be very important, because we had these 2-foot high mounds, and this is a very shallow area. The shallowest, it's only 5 feet deep, and you need 3 feet of vertical clearance at a minimum. So in those 5-foot areas, we kind of avoided the use of mounds. So we use that side scan and the echo sounder data to place our mounds in the deeper water and our flats in the more shallow areas. And so you can see that we've also used the in situ sampling and the sonar and the echo sounder to inform that site design. So after the site is constructed, we continue to use both our recreational and scientific units to verify the construction. So basically in our contracts, the vendor, we have 1 week to sign off on the work to confirm that the vendor has done the job accordingly. They've placed the culch in the right place, that there aren't any navigational hazards. Again, it takes a very long time to mobilize our scientific vessel. It's got a lot of projects going on. So we have this fleet of recreational units that we can use to do kind of intermittent checks as the construction is going on, and then kind of a first check after it's completed to use a side scan to check that the culch was put in the right place, and the echo sounder to make sure there weren't any egregious depth violations. So this is some examples of culture verification using the hummingbird. So this is an old hummingbird on, it's not great imagery, but it was enough to show us that yes, the mounds were approximately in the right location. Each point was where a mound was planned, and then you can see where they actually placed the mounds. And this is the image that I showed before. You can actually see the mounds on the right. They're very clear. Yes, they did place the mounds. On the left, you can actually measure. There's measuring tools in the software. You can measure the distance from the surface of the water to the top of the mound and check on your vertical clearance and the dimensions of the mounds to make sure they were the right diameter and the right height and all of that. But of course, we always go back with a scientific survey as quickly as we can. We do monitoring, we do multi-beam monitoring of these sites to see how they change over time. We've done a project where we use the multi-beam to see how they change after harvest. So after one season of harvest, have these reefs been reduced in vertical relief? So obviously it's important to get the scientific equipment out there, especially if you're looking at navigation clearance and it's kind of close. But in areas where it's really not too close and you don't have the time, you can kind of use the recreational sonar to pass you in the meantime until the scientific vessel can get there maybe a week later or 2 weeks later. So I just have a bunch of examples here of the recreational unit imagery of restoration sites. These are mounds, just 2 images of mounds from one of our less nice older units. Again, mounds as seen from our older units. This one's a really good one because a few years ago, Texas passed a requirement that oyster shellfish dealers have to return 30% of culch by volume of what was harvested. And so we have industry members that go out and place culch multiple times throughout a season. So you can just take your recreational unit on a skiff, go out there and scan it, very reactively as soon as they're done in this patchwork approach, and just make sure that they placed them in the right boundaries of the area. So you can see this thing looks like it's been patched together because it has. Like, one day they did this quadrant and then the next day, we'll do this quadrant. So you can kind of use it that way. But of course, if you want to do a real study looking at bathymetry, or if you have monitoring requirements of a grant, you should get a scientific unit out here. And this is our edge tech showing the actual bathymetric change on the right, which is really interesting because you can see all of the spuds. So these are all barge spuds, the kind of deep holes. So you have these nice 2-foot high mounds, and then you have a 2-foot deep hole right next to it where the barge spud went in the ground. So you need the scientific equipment to really evaluate all of that. And then this is an image from our edge tech unit. This is another kind of experimental restoration site where we have these 2-foot mounds and we place them either 20 feet on center or 40 feet on center spacing, so we can look at the halo effect around oyster restoration. Basically, how far away from the immediate culch placement is this unrestored reef benefited, or is it only where you place the culch? So we came back in with our scientific unit and did that. We also use the same suite of equipment for system-wide benthic mapping, basically just long-term assessment, long-term, large-scale, low-resolution assessment of oyster habitat across the entire Texas coast, one bay system at a time. I appreciate what he said earlier about this feeling like robots doing this, because it's just 16-hour days of driving in a straight line at 4 knots. It's thrilling. So this is Copano Bay in Texas. This is an example of a final product that has both side scan imagery and multi-beam bathymetry, or this was a single beam bathymetry survey, and all of the oyster reef digitized. And so this is really the goal. We want this in every bay system every 10 years so we can actually evaluate. So if you look in Texas, there's very few places where you actually have 2 mapping data sets in the same area using the same methods over time. So it's very difficult to do a change analysis. There's only 3 bays that actually have comparable data sets between multiple years in them, because I think you were talking about the chain surveys. That's what most of them from the 70s, you have a chain survey and then you have these multi-beam side scan surveys, and they're really not comparable. So our goal is to just map the entire Texas coast and then turn around and map it again. So I kind of talked about this earlier and just kind of recap. So the way we do this is we combine both the information from our side scan and our echo sounder. So first you can see an image, you know, your little dark area right here, you can see an image on the side scan. You say, okay, this is definitely different than surroundings. So I'm going to delineate that. I'm going to say this is some sort of feature, but you're going to come back and use the data from your echo sounder to confirm that it is actually hard and rough, to make sure it is an oyster reef and not just a clay bed or a rangia bed. Or we had one area where there was just all of these benthic worms that were so hard it looked like an oyster reef, and we had to go back in with our echo sounder data to kind of tease that out. So we kind of used both of those pieces of information concurrently to do these maps. And so this is an example of just something that was identifiable in the single beam echo sounder that didn't really show up on the side scan. So you can see on the right, I'm going to just show you this. There's this dark area here that you would delineate on a side scan and say, ooh, that's a habitat. But there's really nothing here on the side scan, but something showed up in the echo sounder. So that ended up being an example of just a hard clay substrate that wasn't an oyster reef, but it did have an echo sounder return. So it's really important to have both of those pieces of information. We're currently manually delineating our maps. We did at one point try to do a automated routine. We're still kind of trying to develop this. So basically we take our single beam echo sounder, we interpolate it into a raster of full coverage, because as you saw, it's really just transects of points directly under the boat. So you have to interpolate it to fill those gaps. And then there's several features. There's depth, rugosity, hardness, 7 other features that come out of the EchoView software, and then our side scan. And we tried to kind of layer those and combine them into a PCA, and then we tried to run an ISO cluster algorithm on this to kind of produce an automated product. The PCA is useful because you can really see from multiple features, not just side scan, but also echo sounder, that this is a degraded hashy oyster reef right here, and this is a really consolidated oyster reef. This is a big mud hole. So just looking at it as a human, you can really see that very obviously. These are 2 different types of oyster reef here, and there's actually a harvest line right there. So I wonder why. So you can see it, but if you try to run an automated algorithm on it, you can also see how streaky this is. The streaks are so intense that the automated algorithm just picks up those streaks. The problem is this particular area is about 5 feet to 6 feet deep, and so there's so much noise in that far field. Your gain adjustments are just off. It's impossible to get a good image unless you triple the time it takes to take a survey and just run lines that are right next to each other. So we really haven't found a good automated way to do this. We're still playing with these variety of PCAs and ISO clustering techniques, but that noise really prevents it in these really shallow systems. So ultimately, we just take these PCAs and things like this and just manually delineate the habitat. But this is what it looks like. So here's some manually delineated habitat in Espiritu Santo Bay and the San Antonio Bay system, and the bathymetry with it. We just finished Lavaca and Tres Palacios. This is from our edge text. The side scan looks a lot better. That's a fairly zoomed out area of an entire estuary or sub-estuary. This drives me crazy. There were 2 lines when we post-processed that was missing GPS data. I guess the GPS cut out. So I look at this beautiful map and I'm like, those 2 lines are driving me crazy, but I'm not going back to fill them in. There's 1 line there. Tres Palacios Bay and the Matagorda Bay system. This one's interesting. So Lavaca Bay is one of the 3 places where you actually have 2 sets of acoustic data over time. And you can see the dark blue line was from a 2002 survey, and the imagery that you're seeing is from the survey that we just completed last year. So you can actually see in 2002, this area was mapped as a contiguous oyster reef, and in 2021, you can actually see these kind of darker mud patches in the middle. So there is kind of an ability to do a little bit of a change analysis and identify areas that have become degraded in terms of substrate health. This is just a map of maps showing where we've mapped and where we're getting ready. We're currently in Aransas Bay surveying right now, but as you can see, these are large surveys. These are entire big old Texas estuary surveys all at once. It takes us about 2 years to complete an entire bay system, and then about a year to finish processing the data. All of our data, if you guys are interested in this, is publicly accessible once it's finished. We actually work pretty hard to make sure all of our shape files, delineations of our habitats are served as ArcGIS online web services, so you can go stream them through AGO or download them, and then all of our rasters available for download from our website. So if anybody wants our data, there it is. And do you have any questions?
Thanks, Emma. That was really interesting, and I learned a lot that I should have already known. Like I didn't know it was even publicly available. I've been asking for that data, and I didn't even know it was even there.
That was thanks to COVID and the 1 million data requests that I got during COVID, and I was working from home, and I was like, we're just going to put this stuff online. Because a lot of people were doing research during those years.
Well, thank you. That's a lot of work, and I appreciate it. I'll save my questions for some other time. Question?
I have one, and this is about this one very subject. Again, we have sanctuaries and open harvest areas. This data is a really good roadmap of where to poach if you want to. So we decided not to serve it up to the public, but we're a nonprofit organization, we can do that. So how did that discussion go, or did it even happen?
So we're a state agency, and all of our data is public, and eventually it got to just an efficiency of how much time it was taking our staff. These are huge data files, and every time someone requests it, we have to serve it. And if we say, you know what, no, they can do a public records request and get it anyway. And it takes a ton of time to package up this data, serve it, make sure it has the right metadata. You have to write an email every time that explains the metadata, how it was collected, how it can be used, disclaimers of how it shouldn't be used, all of that. And eventually, just because we have to make it available anyway, it was just far easier to serve it, just for the sake of staff resources and time.
And then a follow, do you have oyster sanctuaries in Texas?
We have 6 sub-bays that were closed to harvest in 2017. So on the entire kind of minor bay scale. There's one actually being proposed now, and our public meeting is on Thursday to evaluate it. And then we have several oyster restoration sites that were made with self-policing culch. So none of our oyster restoration sites have a permanent closure by regulation or commission action, but they use just large boulders so they can't be harvested with dredges.
Yeah, just a comment in that respect. Most of these areas that were mapped, and this data refers to our publicly accessible for the commercial fishery. So it's open harvest.
Thanks, Emma. All right, next we have Tiffanie Cross, I believe, talking about the continuous video with AI to monitor recreational fisheries.
Turn my mic on, that'll help. All right. So I'm here to talk about the ongoing work that we have to monitor Florida's recreational fishery. And my talk today is going to give you an overview of that fishery in Florida, how it's currently monitored, camera-based methods that have been used in other areas, the inclusion of machine learning into those methods, and then what we're doing in Florida to see if it can be done with our fishery, and then where we're going in the future. So the recreational saltwater fishery consists of 2.4 million saltwater licenses. And of those licenses, we have 700,000 state reef fish survey designations. So that's 700,000 people that say that they fish for reef fish in Florida. And the fishery supports 88,500 jobs and contributes to $9.2 billion of economic impact. So the reef fish fishery in Florida consists of a small proportion of overall recreational trips. However, the private boat sector is the majority of those trips. And so we need to monitor what's going on with that. But the monitoring is very difficult. We have a lot of people that participate in the fishery, and because there's highly managed fisheries, they're pulse fisheries with high temporal and spatial variability, and it's dispersed over a very large area. And so these reef fish trips are also less frequently encountered in general surveys. So on Florida's South Atlantic coast, the fishery there is an offshore boat-based fishery, and that fishery utilizes distinct inlets to access the Atlantic Ocean, which is convenient. And in the case of the Atlantic red snapper, that fishery is highly managed, and it also has experienced short seasons since we've been monitoring it since 2012. And the general surveys that monitor these fisheries weren't designed to capture these derby events precisely. So the ongoing monitoring that's happening for these recreational fisheries are surveys that are concurrent and overlapping. And the statewide surveys that are currently operating is NOAA Fisheries Access Point Angler Intercept Survey and the Fishing Effort Survey. And then the for hire sector is covered by the for hire survey. And then Florida Fish and Wildlife operates a supplemental survey, a specialized survey called the State Reef Fish Survey that is designed to improve estimates for reef fish. And then on the South Atlantic, we have the Atlantic Red Snapper in Season Survey that was developed to capture these really short derby seasons for red snapper. And all of these surveys have inherent sources of error and unknown biases. And so there's a need to validate the accuracy of the estimates generated by these surveys. So that Atlantic red snapper in season survey I just told you about consists of biologists that count boats as they come into those specific inlets. So the boats going in and out, we tally those. And then concurrently, we have biologists at the dockside interviewing anglers as they come back to ask them what time they went out the inlet, if they did. And if they did go out the inlet, what did they do? Did they go fishing or did they not? And if they did go fishing, what did they fish for? And this survey has been ongoing since 2012, and it produces precise estimates of landings and effort. However, it's very labor intensive and it's very costly. So how can we develop cost-efficient methods to scale this survey temporally and spatially to use it to validate these other general surveys that operate? And that's where the camera-based monitoring comes in. So in the past, since the early 2000s through the 2010s, cameras, so closed caption cameras and more recently IP-based cameras have been used to monitor these fisheries using human reviewers that go back and look at the video and enumerate vessels. So the advantage of this method is that you can have 24-hour monitoring, whereas if you just have people on the ground counting, you can't see boats after dark very well. It's a little less labor intensive and it's less costly. And the work that has occurred has been in Australia and New Zealand and Germany. Hartle and Edwards has a really nice paper that summarizes those works with really nice insights and lessons learned. So if you want to do this, read that paper and avoid some of their pitfalls. And then in the US, Powers and Anson has conducted work in Alabama. And recently, machine learning has come in as a tool to help automate these processes, which is much less labor intensive. And there's a higher cost startup wise, but then if you're going to do it long term, the costs decrease compared to ongoing labor intensive year after year surveys. And so I stumbled upon a white paper that was released by the Environmental Defense Fund about their Smart Pass program. And that program was developed in Oregon, in coastal Oregon, and to monitor all of their fisheries. And Oregon also has very specific inlets like we do in Florida. The fishery accesses the Pacific Ocean. And so I got really interested in, well, can we do this in Florida? So I talked with the scientists in Oregon, and I talked with the companies that were contracted to help make this go, and said, well, you know, maybe we can do this. And we learned that not only does it help automate the counts, but we can also learn from this machine learning that it's got really great pattern recognition. We can refine survey methods from the lessons learned over the pattern, spatial and temporal patterns, to streamline our survey design and improve efficiencies there. We get near real-time counts. We get year-round coverage, 24 hours a day. We can fill coverage gaps that we haven't been able to do because we don't have enough people or resources, money. And then we can perhaps increase precision of our estimates and have a better understanding of the fishery. So after learning all of these lessons from the previous works that have been done and having mentorship through the scientists in Oregon, we got to work and identified 3 sites on Florida's Atlantic coast that vary in their complexities. So we wanted differences in size, so smaller inlets and really big inlets. Their logistical considerations is there a military base right nearby, like in Mayport, or you know, how much vessel traffic goes through. And so in talking with all of these different technology providers, we settled upon working with C-Vision AI to help us with the machine learning aspect of this project. And we wanted to test the feasibility of using artificial intelligence to continuously monitor the recreational boating activity in these inlets. So our objectives in the first year was to identify hardware that would work for the specific inlets that we've chose and get those systems installed and running. And then we wanted to take the existing algorithms that had been developed for these other locations, like in Oregon, and see how well they would work on the vessels that we have in Florida, which are very different from vessels that go in the Pacific Ocean in Oregon. And then take what we learned from that initial run, detect, classify, track, and count vessels entering and exiting the inlets, evaluate the performance of those algorithms versus human observers. So there's a whole slew of logistical considerations, many of which I did not put on the slide. But you need to consider what infrastructure is already there at these inlets nearby. And then who owns the land, who owns the buildings, and can we partner with them to put our cameras up? So there was a lot of contractual and legal work involved. Special use permits from the state lands to be able to put cameras out. And then, you know, if you're partnering with agencies like the military, what are their restrictions on what you can and can't do? And then for the specific sites, you know, is there electricity, or do you need to have completely off grid? Is there internet? And if there isn't, then can you put a cellular network out there? The size considerations, how strong of a lens do you need? How many cameras do you need to cover that inlet? And then how easy is it to access the equipment? Are you gonna have to climb a 20-foot tower every time you need to go out and change something? Or do you just take a little ladder with you and it's easy? And then the exposure to the elements. You have salt water from the ocean, sand and dust and all sorts of things to consider. Birds that want to rest on your equipment that poop on them. not great. So, so the hardware that we identified that would work for our situation consisted of cameras by Lucid Technologies, their 4K imaging sensors, and then rugged Intel-based data loggers. That are DC capable, so that we could put battery backups on them, or if we wanted to take them completely off grid, we can. And that's what these little yellow boxes are. They're kind of like, they're being used in some vehicles, and they've got these little heat sinks already built in to help with getting too hot, which is a concern because it's already super hot in Florida. And then for cellular antenna access, or cellular network access, we put out 4G cellular antenna boosters in places where the cellular network was kind of poor. And then we have to have waterproof and dustproof and shockproof housings, brackets and cables and things that you might forget. That I have a whole list, so if you're interested, I'm happy to provide all that stuff. And then lithium batteries and chargers for backup. So when you have a power outage, the computer will run until the power comes back on. So the first inlet that we chose was Cumberland Sound. It's on the very northern tip of Florida with Georgia border. We installed the system in January of 2022. It's super remote location. There's very poor cellular connectivity, unreliable electricity. It's a huge inlet. It's 1.7 miles from the camera to the tips of the jetties. And the cameras are located on a bat house. So this is a beach access with a restroom, and then there's a little closet in here that the Army Corps of Engineers stores some of their GPS equipment. And so I was able to partner with them to store our computers in there and run the cabling from the antenna on the house in, and this is where the computer's kept. And so the idea here is the camera looks at these jetty tips, and there's an imaginary line that once a boat crosses it, it's considered in the ocean, and reversed when the boats come back. And this particular location has a lot of cargo ships that come and go, and the Kings Bay submarine station for the US Navy is just upriver as well. Mayport is another complicated inlet in the fact that the Navy station Mayport is literally right there. So across the river, across the St. Johns River from there is a park that's very busy with people, and so you had to consider if you tried to put the camera there, would it get tampered with, etc. So I approached the Navy and felt really weird asking them if I can put a camera on the Navy base to record vessel traffic 24 hours a day. But I did, and they said yes. So I work with the environmental office there. They have a whole environmental science division that tracks sea turtle nests and other environmental conditions and the Navy impacts to natural resources. So in this particular location, you also cannot have a cellular network because the Navy does not want data transmitted off the Navy base. And so it's a show up with the security, get the hardware or the hard drive, swap it out and take it home, and then manually upload that once you're on a different network. The electricity is super reliable. It's also a large inlet. It's about a mile from the camera to the jetty tips. And again, military and cargo ships that come in and out of the St. Johns River. And then Ponce Inlet was kind of our like Grand Slam easy inlet. It's already got a lifeguard station here by Volusia County Beach Safety. It's got all the infrastructure. They already have cameras up there, but they don't do the types of things that we need them to do to use those. It's got strong cellular. It's only 3,300 feet from camera to jetty tip. And the only issue here is it is right on the ocean. So you get lots of ocean spray, dust from the wind, super windy. So that's been an issue as well. And so we've had all these various speed bumps along the way with just the hardware installation and getting things to where you don't have to babysit them constantly. One problem that we didn't really think of was if you're trying to monitor a fishery that you need to have cameras facing east, you're going to capture the sun during the sunrise, which you can't see anything when that happens. So we had this really awful sun glare, and we were able to find polarizing filters that took care of the sun glare. Here you can see that this is a morning image of like 7:50 in the morning. Normally this would be completely blared out, but with the polarizing lens, it's really taken that and cleared it up. And an unexpected benefit is that at nighttime, the vessels that are running their lights had these huge blooms without the polarizing lens. And when you take the polarizing lens and put it on, it just pinpoints those lights and makes it easier to detect the vessels. We had, because of the sun glare, it heated up the cases, and we had condensation on the inside of the lenses. And I thought that our cases were leaking. It turns out they weren't, thank goodness. But we ordered desiccant packs and stuffed the cases full of desiccant packs, solved the problem. We added battery backups for power outages, recording to hard drives in the event that there's cellular network outages. And then, unfortunately, during the red snapper season, we had a huge storm come up, and we had lightning strike one of our cameras and knocked it out. So those are some things that you just can't control for, and things happen. So after we got the hardware stuff figured out, we started focusing on getting these algorithms going. And so the vessel detection portion of, or the vessel detection algorithm utilizes the YOLO v5 detection architecture, which is open source on GitHub. And it's been trained on vessel imagery across the country. And so then once the algorithm detects a vessel, you need to know how accurately it's doing that. And so the idea here is, it's called intersection over union. And there's a ground truthing bounding box around the object of interest. In this case, it's a stop sign. And then the algorithm draws a box over what it thinks is what you want it to detect. And then how well those boxes overlap is how accurate your detection is. And so we did that with the boats. And then we also installed or programmed some motion estimating filters to have the algorithm, once it got a boat in a box, we wanted it to track to see, did it go out the inlet or did it not? And so we trained the algorithms by reviewing the video, literally drawing boxes over the boats, thousands and thousands of them, assigning a type. So this is really small and it was hard to capture, but essentially this is a boat with a box around it. And in this application, you can say it's a fishing or non-fishing or an unknown type of boat. And this creates a ground truthing data set. And this whole process is iterative. So you start with 500 boats, run the algorithm, see where it's not performing well, and saying, okay, we need to get more of those types of boats. And then you can go in the video and draw boxes around those types of boats and continue. More annotation, rerun models, rinse, repeat until you get to a point that you're satisfied with how it's performing. So our detection and tracking criteria, we wanted it to count recreational boats. We don't know if those boats are fishing or if they're not fishing, but they look like recreational boats, count them. Don't count the waves or the people or the birds or anything else that's not a recreational boat. And then tracking, we wanted the boat to travel at least 50% of the channel and meet a height to length ratio so that that helped the algorithm, if it lost the track or if it lost the detection of a boat because of a wave or another boat went in front of it, it wouldn't pick it back up and count it twice or 3 times or 4 times. And then the height to length ratio was helpful in helping the algorithm identify like a sport fishing boat compared to a sailboat that's tall and skinny, or a huge tug or something like that. And so this is what the algorithm in action looks like. The purple box are the objects that were tracked and will be counted. And the gray box is a tracked object that's either been counted already or it's identified it and it's waiting to see if it's going to go 50% down the channel, and then it's going to count it. It'll turn purple. And then it's really hard to see, but there's like a light gray sand colored box here, and it's saying like, oh, I see the thing, but I don't care about that thing. And so this is Ponce Inlet, and there is an Army Corps of Engineer exercise or ongoing project here to bolster this jetty. And so we've got a huge crane out here with tugs that come and go. And when I'm going to play these videos, and you'll see the gray boxes as boats start entering the frame, and then they travel, they turn purple. And this whole time it's saying like, oh, I see the thing, but I don't care about it. So this is 7 in the morning on July 8th, which is opening day of the Atlantic red snapper season in Florida for federal waters. We got 2 people that came back in, they forgot something or who knows. Okay, and then this next one might be hard to see, but there's a flock of pelicans that are going to fly toward the camera. And we don't want the algorithm to count those. Here they come, and they just turned gray and then they disappeared. So I was happy to see that it can say, oh, it's a pelican, don't count that thing. So we had some speed bumps along the way with the algorithms as well. So with the inlets that are huge, so Mayport and Cumberland Sound, we didn't have the zoom that we needed to be able to see if is that a boat or is that a wave or what is that thing. And if humans can't count it, you can't expect an algorithm to count it. And so this is George Costanza. He's like, what is that thing? Like, we don't know. And then this is just an example I thought was cool, is a sub coming out of Kings Bay, or coming back into Kings Bay that we captured. So how do you evaluate the performance of the algorithm? Well, because we didn't have any footage to use from the other 2 inlets, we used Ponce Inlet, and we decided that we would do a ground truthing study on July 8th and 9th, which is red snapper season, because we already have that Atlantic red snapper in-season survey that happens. We have observers counting boats at all the inlets. It's a perfect opportunity to see, is it working, is it not, and how does it compare? And so the algorithms are detecting, tracking, and classifying vessels and counting them. Human observers in real time are doing the same thing. And then we also had human reviewed video. So all the video we collected, we had people in the lab reviewing it and enumerating all the boats by each hour. And that's our truth data set. So these are preliminary results from just the 2 days. And this is the human real-time observers on the ground versus human review of the video. And the real-time observers undercounted the vessels consistently, and their average error rate was between 4% and 8%, which is pretty good. So these graphs are the number of boats exiting the inlet and the number of boats entering the inlet, so coming back. The gray bars are the human real-time, so that's the observer. The blue bars are the human review of the video, or a truth data set. And you can see the little discrepancies over time. But, you know, overall, not bad. And then there's the algorithm versus the human reviewed video. It also undercounted consistently, and the error rate was between 7 and 10%, also not bad. I was pretty excited about it. The algorithm here is the brown bar, and then the blue bar again is the human reviewed video. And, you know, it was pretty close consistently throughout the day. And then, we talked about the pattern recognitions and things that we can learn about the fishery that we may not see because we're only out there observing vessels for distinct hours in a day and not after dark. There's a peak of vessels, as you would expect, exiting the inlet in the morning and then coming back home in the evening or in the afternoon. And this yellow line here is when human observers begin counting boats on the ground and when they go home for the day. And again, on the second day, it's sunrise and sunset. And we have little shifts of people that count boats throughout the day. And we were able to capture boat trips occurring outside of the observer hours. So we are able to make corrections for that by just interviewing people when they come back from their fishing trips. What time did you go out the inlet this morning? And so now we have a method of comparing our correction factors pretty good compared to what we actually see in the video. And so this is what it looks like in the dark hours before sunrise on July 8th at the opening of Red Snapper. And again, purple is tracked objects, gray is they're either counted already or they're going to be counted. And then that really sand color thing is something that the algorithm doesn't care about. This is 5:30 in the morning. And it's just a parade. So it's pretty neat that we have an opportunity now to capture the true effort of what's happening in the fishery and compare our method of applying the corrections from information from the dockside interviews. So looking ahead in year 2, we definitely want to fix the optics issues at those large inlets. And we're considering a completely new all-in-one camera that has variable zoom so that we're not completely married to and buying all these different lenses that you have to climb the ladder, switch it out, say, how does it look? Not great, and rinse, repeat. Getting up on those ladders is scary, and I do that. And then this little graphic was funny. This is in PowerPoint, but this is the guy standing on top of the top step of the ladder, messing around with the camera. I didn't do that, by the way. And then this idea of testing a cross-channel view. So if you remember, these cameras are trained at the jetty tips. And when we do that, those boats are really far away. And when they're close, we only get them for like a little second before they're too far away to really classify if it's a charter or a private boat. And so we're thinking that if we could do a cross-channel view, we get a longer view of that vessel when it goes by. Maybe we can get down to more information about charter, headboat, sport, private boat. And so we're going to try that out at a couple of these different inlets. These algorithms have not been trained for nighttime, so we'll be doing a lot of boxes around lights and vessels at night to see if we can get that honed in. And then, continue to improve the overall performance of the algorithms. And then eventually, once we have all those things dialed in, scale this to additional sites. And so this is what I was talking about, the cross-channel view. This is Mayport. And so we could basically cut the distance across by half almost and get better, longer views of these vessels when they go by. And there's already 2 cameras here, so we could just train one, looking across the channel instead of down channel or downrange. So scaling to the additional sites, the State Reef Fish Survey is stratified by region in the state of Florida. And this specific region is region G on our survey form that we mail out to anglers. And if we can scale, so this is Cumberland Sound, this one's Mayport, this is Ponce Inlet. This is Volano Inlet in St. Augustine. Matanzas Inlet is tiny, and we could just do some human counts and get a ratio and apply that, so we don't need a camera there. And then we have Port Canaveral that we could expand to. which is obviously some pretty serious logistical concerns with the Space Force Base and the Port of Canaveral and NASA and everything right there. And then Sebastian Inlet. And so if we can get coverage of all of these sites, we can then take the State Reef Fish Survey estimate that's generated and compare it to an effort estimate from the algorithms and see, is the State Reef Fish Survey performing well? And how is it doing? So it's an effort to validate that survey. So there's a tremendous amount of partnerships that have gone into making this project work. We've worked with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Lisa Holland and Curtis Hall out of the Jacksonville office have been very supportive of our work at Cumberland Sound. The Florida State Parks also have been instrumental in getting our cameras out and ideas for where would be a good place to place them. The U.S. Navy Environmental Office, Arnie Olson and Heather Hahn. The Volusia County in Florida, there's a beach safety team. So up in that little lifeguard tower, there's people there all the time. If I need a reset, I can call them on the phone and say, hey, can you reset the camera? Or, the lens is really dirty. Do you mind going and wiping it off real quick? And they've been amazingly supportive. And then the permitting and guidance of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And I didn't put it up here, but also Oregon Department of Fish and Game has been really instrumental in their mentorship and helping us figure out lessons that they've learned so that we don't have to struggle through some of those same pitfalls. And with that, I'd like to answer any questions if we have time.
Thanks, Tiffany. We have about maybe 4 minutes for questions. It's very interesting. Thank you. I think every state here would probably, take some notes, and it's easily applied at a lot of places across the Gulf. So I had a question. Yeah, there's a lot of work as it was, but did you guys compare any landings estimates to the boats coming into those areas at all?
So not yet. The next stage here would be to take our existing dockside interview survey and add some questions that would allow us to get information of all of those recreational boats going out the inlet. How many of those are fishing? How many of them are just, recreating? And so that's in future work. We'll be able to do that.
Trevor?
Much same question, right? Because MRIP goes down the questions, and it's all generally with fishing on summary form, and there's not really anything in there that designates true recreation in the sense of non-fishing activity. It's non-vent fish or commercial, anything else. I think that'd be a good distribution. But also, I wonder, did y'all perhaps reach out to the Department of Transportation or any other state agencies that might deal with a lot of this camera work and deal with a lot of probably machine learning in this aspect? Because the reason I asked the question is you could have areas just like what we do, right? You've got inlets that are perfect for this kind of work. Then you might have other areas that you don't necessarily have those direct inlets that you can do estimation like this for some corroborative measurement, but there are cameras everywhere on roadways and passes and turnpikes and tolls and everything else. You can only imagine at some point this is going to start to become commonplace for a lot of our work.
Right. So I did reach out to the DOT and for a couple of the different inlets that we were considering. So Ponce Inlet and Sebastian Inlet in our initial investigations. And if they do have cameras up, they're not recording, they're not committed to recording that and storing that much data for us to go back and use. But then they were like, oh, can we get your data? You do the thing, and can we have the, and so the answer was, of course, if we can share. There's a particular project going on in Sebastian where they're looking at replacing that bridge, and they're trying to get an idea of all of the traffic and vessels that go under that bridge to see how high they are. Like, what's the tallest vessel? And they were interested in using our data for that, but we ended up not using Sebastian Inlet. But yeah, it's really, there are cameras out, but a lot of them are like the eye in the sky 360 view to capture what's happening on the beach and the inlet, and that type of camera footage didn't lend to the types of questions that we were trying to answer.
Absolutely, yeah. 'Cause I can see, the work y'all are doing has the potential to provide direct estimation along with direct comparisons of estimates from other surveys. But then you've got the other side of, potentially having some corroborative look at, like, what John Foster and Richard's group, when they look at rod sales over time and stuff like that, just other variables that can play into some idea of the scaling of effort over time. But no, I enjoyed it.
Sure. And on the note about just general boating recreation, so we get a list of our vessel registrations in Florida, and so there's potential for creating a completely separate survey that goes to the vessel owner and says, it's basically like, did you take a trip during the last month, and what did you do? Along the same lines of what we're already doing for the recreational fishery, but have it be more of a recreational boating survey. So.
Joe?
Mike Randall has a question from online. Would it be possible to cross-correlate with AIS data for head boat versus wreck boat?
So the answer is yes. So we do see head boats go in and out, and I thought it would be useful to be able to validate that they took trips and probably cross-reference the AIS. But for the small, like the private sector of the recreational fishery, don't run AIS. So I'm not sure if that answers that question, but for head boats, yeah, that would be useful.
Matt?
So it's kind of along the same lines as that question. I know you're talking about the AIS, but you touched on the zoom capabilities of the cameras several times, and obviously you probably see more footage of this than anyone. So when you're talking about this cross-channel option, do you feel like, or I know it's not going to happen in all inlets, but you would get to a point to where you would be able to see clearly the vessel registration in and out?
So I know that it can be done. One of the challenges with this type of project is the data files are humongous. So that is a problem when you have a 100 gigabyte cellular network plan for that specific location that might have 2 camera feeds. So you've doubled that and you're trying to upload all that data in a month. And if you exceed it, they don't call you up and say, hey, you're about to go over, would you like to purchase more data? They just cut you off and you don't know, unless you're like completely incessantly checking the data plan every day. So what we do is we down sample the video. So we take, fewer frames per second, because if a boat is in the first frame, it's going to be in the 10th and 20th, that sort of thing. And we also decrease the resolution of the video to make the file smaller, which impacts our ability to see the FL, like a registration number, right? So it's possible, but it has costs, and there's cost and benefits of that.
So let me follow up with, because y'all are the state that's famous for this, with all your toll roads. So is it do you have at some point, or is there a system that you've seen or the people you talk to from Oregon or for a scan tool? So all these states are going to these offshore fishing permits trying to get effort. So part of that was some type of barcode. I mean, with these cameras, or in your opinion, obviously you've done it more than any of us have, would you have the ability to add something like that to where you're not having this huge database. It's just a scan, and you would know which vessel you would be able to, whether it's charter, headboat, private rec. You would already have that on the back end somehow. Is that something? It just piqued my interest when you said with the cross-channel stuff. We're in a very similar situation with the information we could gather from something like that.
Mm-hmm. I think it could be done. I don't know. I don't know at what cost it be, I mean, you'd really need to sit down and look at the trade-offs of how much data you'd be transmitting to get resolution at that level. And then there's also considerations about, angler buy-in of the program and, having it not be anonymous anymore. Right now, it's completely anonymous. We just know that a recreational vessel went out the inlet, but we don't know who it is. And, we can't check them off of a list of a known registration type of thing, right? So I think it can be done. It depends on how much money you want to spend. And with this project, the cost of running the algorithms is expensive. And it would be more costly when you're looking at that resolution of not only is there a registration number there, but then what is it, right? And that's really complicated. You're talking about just a few pixels out of all of the pixels. So, it just depends on what the goal of the project is. And if a human can do it within a few seconds, then an algorithm can too. And so if you want to spend the money on really high-powered optics at all of the different levels across the entire channel, which is complicated at a place like Cumberland Sound and Mayport compared to like Sebastian Inlet or Ponce Inlet, where they're small. It's not gonna. I don't think it's gonna work as easily everywhere.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. I think Scott has the last question. Scott, go ahead.
On. All right. Hey, so in Alabama, we've had a camera system for about the last 12 or 13 years. And one way that we tried to limit cost was it is a wireless system. We built our own network, so we transmit our data wirelessly so we don't have recurring cellular costs. So that was helpful. We get it into a fiber network and then we store it on a server. And so we have also used it to count boats. We have one camera that in Perdido Pass that counts the boats that exit and enter. And so again, not to the resolution of, hey, identifying this is a specific type of boat, although you can get to that. Again, like she said, it's all about the dollars. How much do you want to spend? If you want to get a camera, we have cameras that can zoom in from about 2.5 miles away, and I can probably tell you the make of the boat, and I can tell you if they're men or women on the boat. I couldn't tell you, I couldn't identify them in the court of law, but I could tell you they're more likely to be men or women from 2.5 miles away. So yes, the camera, and that technology is dropping every year. The cost of that technology goes down. So, but if anybody has an interest, I know we're pushing up against lunch, they want to talk later of how we use our system. And I came in late on your presentation. I apologize for that, but the technologies are there. Our contractor says, yes, we could read registration numbers but again, you have to slew the camera. There's some other data, and this is how much money do you have? When we first started the program, it was out of the Huntsville Space and Rocket Center, and they said, we can do whatever you want if you have a checkbook big enough. So, and then the other thing is we have used the cameras to focus specifically on our more common boat ramps that would for snapper checked, and we verified our snapper check program. And the University of South Alabama did an evaluation of that video, and their numbers mimicked snapper check numbers. And again, just to throw the plug in, our numbers and their numbers were much more similar than the federal numbers, but there was the ability to count anglers. We could count gear. You could look at the gear and say, are they more likely than not rigged for reef fish fishing? So again, I just wanted to throw that out there. I'd be more than happy to talk my limited knowledge of our system.
Thanks for the additional information, Scott. I mean, that's the whole point of this, is for us to kind of get together and figure out what's going on in other states and what we can learn and share. So